Preface. What happened to the country we grew up in? Like Death of the West a decade ago, this book seeks to answer that question. But Suicide of a Superpower is being published in another time, in another America. When Death of the West came out on New Year's 2002, the nation was united and resolved. America had just swept to a bloodless victory over the Taliban, and a triumphant George W. Bush had the approval of 9 in 10 of his countrymen. In his State of the Union address that same month, the President informed the axis of evil nations we were coming for them, and in his second inaugural address he would call Americans to a great crusade to, quote, end tyranny in our world. Hubristic Times. This book is published after 10 years of war in Afghanistan, 8 in Iraq, the worst recession and debt crisis America has faced since the 1930s, with the nation divided and seemingly everywhere in retreat. We have entered an era of austerity and retrenchment, unlike any this generation has ever known. But not only is it in the realm of economics and politics that America appears in a downward spiral. Socially, culturally, morally, America has taken on the aspect of a decadent society and a declining nation. When the faith dies, the culture dies, the civilization dies, the people die. That is the progression. And as the faith that gave birth to the West is dying in the West, peoples of European descent, from the steppes of Russia to the coast of California, have begun to die out as the Third World treks north to claim the estate. The last decade provided corroborating, if not conclusive, proof that we are in the Indian summer of our civilization. Historian Arnold Toynbee wrote, quote, civilizations die from suicide, not by murder, unquote. And so it is. We are the prodigal sons who squandered their inheritance, but unlike the prodigal son, we can't go home again. Introduction. Disintegrating Nation. Pity the nation divided into fragments, each fragment deeming itself a nation. Khalil Gibran, 1934. I think the nation is coming apart. George Kennan, 2000. The centrifugal forces have become dominant. Lee Hamilton, 2010. Will the Soviet Union survive until 1984? That was the title of a 1970 essay by Russian dissident Andrei Amalrik. Forced into exile, Amalrik died in a car crash in Spain in 1980. Few had taken him seriously. Yet 9 years after his death, the Soviet Empire had collapsed and the Soviet Union disintegrated. What is this to do with us? More than we might imagine. As did the Soviet Union, America commands an empire of allies, bases, and troops. America, too, is engaged in a seemingly endless war in Afghanistan. America, too, is an ideological nation. America, too, is a land of many races, tribes, cultures, creeds, and languages. America, too, has reached imperial overstretch. Many will reflexively reject this comparison. Where the Soviet Empire was a prison house of nations whose Marxist ideology had been imposed by force and terror, America is a democracy whose allies have freely sought her protection. Yet the similarities should alarm us, for ethno-nationalism, the force that tore the Soviet Union apart, that relentless drive of peoples to separate that translates into tribalism within a country, is not only pulling our world apart, it is tearing at the seams of American union. And the ideals that once defined us as a people, freedom, equality, democracy, have been corrupted into concepts more reminiscent of Marxist revolutions than of the American Revolution. For what is a nation? Is it not a people of a common ancestry, culture, and language, who worship the same God, revere the same heroes, cherish the same history, celebrate the same holidays, share the same music, poetry, art, literature, held together, in Lincoln's words, by, quote, bonds of affection, mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone. If that is what a nation is, can we truly say America is still a nation? The European and Christian core of our country is shrinking. The birth rate of our native born has been below replacement level for decades. By 2020, deaths among white Americans will exceed births, while mass immigration is altering forever the face of America. The Atlantic magazine titled its January-February 2009 cover story, quote, "The End of White America?" unquote. Newsweek's 2009 Easter cover was entitled "The Decline and Fall of Christian America." The statistics bear these stories out. And for the United States, as for any nation, the death of its cradle faith brings social disintegration, an end to moral community, and culture war. Meanwhile, globalization dissolves the bonds of economic dependency that held us together as a people, as the cacophony of multiculturalism drowns out the old culture. Is America coming apart? This book's answer is yes. Our nation is disintegrating, ethnically, culturally, morally, politically. Not only do we not love one another as Christ's teaching commands, we seem to detest each other in ways as deep as Southerners detested a mercantile North and Northerners detested an agrarian slaveholding South. Half of America views abortion as the killing of the unborn meriting the wrath of God. The other half regards right to life as a reactionary movement and repressive ideology. In 2009, George Tiller became the fourth abortionist to be assassinated, while James Poulin was shot and killed outside Owasso High School in Michigan while staging an anti-abortion protest. Advocates of gay marriage see adversaries as homophobic bigots. Opponents see advocates as seeking to elevate unnatural acts to the moral and legal status of sacred matrimony. Where one half of America sees progress, the other half sees decadence. The common moral ground on which we once stood, united, is gone. Christmas and Easter, the holy days of Christendom, once united us in joy. Now we fight over whether they may be mentioned in public schools. Half of America regards her history as glorious. The other half reviles it as racist. Old heroes like Columbus and Robert E. Lee may be replaced on calendars by Martin Luther King and Cesar Chavez, but the old holidays and heroes endure, as the new put down only the shallowest of roots in Middle America. Mexican Americans may celebrate Cinco de Mayo, but to most Americans, that was the date of a skirmish in a war about which they know little and care nothing, that took place in the year of the bloodiest battle ever fought on American soil, Antietam. Our 24-hour cable news networks have chosen sides in the culture and political wars. Even our music seems designed to divide us. Where once we had classical, pop, country, and western, and jazz, now we have countless varieties tailored to separate and exclude races, generations, and ethnic groups. We are seceding from one another, not only on matters of morality, politics, and culture, but race. When President Obama was inaugurated, there was talk and hope of a new, quote, post-racial America, unquote. But 3 weeks into Obama's administration, Attorney General Eric Holder began Black History Month by calling us a nation of cowards for not discussing the subject of race more openly. Conservatives who opposed Justice Sonia Sotomayor and stood with Sergeant James Crowley in his confrontation with Harvard professor Henry Louis Gates, Jr., were denounced as racist. They threw the same ugly word back in the face of their accusers and Barack Obama. In August 2009, when crowds turned out for town hall meetings to oppose health care reform, Majority Leader Harry Reid called them, quote, evilmongers, unquote, and Speaker Nancy Pelosi called their conduct, quote, un-American, End quote. Yet by year's end, Americans had a more favorable view of the Tea Party than of the Democratic Party. When Congressman Joe Wilson shouted, "You lie," at Obama during an address to a joint session of Congress, his apology was accepted by the president. But that did not satisfy the Congressional Black Caucus, which demanded a roll call vote to rub Wilson's nose in it. One Black Caucus member, Congressman Hank Johnson, said Wilson had, quote, instigated racism and must be rebuked or we will, quote, have folks putting on white hoods and white robes again, riding through the countryside intimidating people, unquote. In Inside the Mind of Joe Wilson, Richard Benjamin, the author of Searching for Whitopia, An Improbable Journey to the Heart of White America, said that the congressman's outburst, quote, exposes a virulent racism and paranoia against undocumented workers, unquote. Jimmy Carter said Wilson's shout had been, quote, based on racism. There is an inherent feeling among many in this country that an African American should not be president, unquote. Carter returned to this theme the following day, quote, I think an overwhelming portion of the intensely demonstrated animosity toward President Barack Obama is based on the fact that he is a black man, that he's African American. I live in the South, and I've seen the South come a long way, and I've seen the rest of the country that shares the South's attitude toward minority groups at that time, particularly African Americans. End quote. How did Carter know what was in Joe Wilson's heart? How did Carter know an overwhelming portion of those who had turned out for town hall meetings were motivated by, quote, the fact that Obama is a black man, that he's African American, end quote. That same week in September 2009, Kanye West stomped onto the stage at the MTV Music Video Awards to grab the microphone from country music singer Taylor Swift and tell her she did not deserve her Best Female Video Award for You Belong With Me, and that the award should have gone to Beyoncé. Race consciousness is rising. Indeed, the first year of the Obama presidency seems to have radicalized much of white America. Ron Brownstein wrote of a startling survey done by the National Journal. Quote, whites are not only more anxious, but also more alienated. Big majorities of whites say the past year's turmoil has diminished their confidence in government, corporations, and the financial industry. Asked which institution they trust most to make economic decisions in their interest, a plurality of whites older than 30 pick none. A grim statement. End quote. By fall 2009, a majority told a USA Network polling firm that we Americans are too divided over race and religion, while 3/4 said we are too divided over politics and economics. A majority believe our divisions have worsened in the new century. Only 1 in 4 saw racial and religious diversity as a national strength. Consider but a few of the issues over which we have fought, often for decades. Prayer and the 10 Commandments in public schools, crosses in public parks, evolution, the death penalty, abortion, assisted suicide, embryonic stem cell research, affirmative action, quotas, busing, the Confederate battle flag, the Duke rape case, letting Terry Schiavo die, amnesty, torture, the war in Iraq. Now it is death panels, global warming, gay marriage, socialism, history books, and whether Barack Obama is really a citizen of the United States. If a married couple fought as bitterly as we Americans do over such basic beliefs, the couple would have divorced and gone their separate ways long ago. The crudeness of our public debate is matched by its incivility. In politics, it is insufficient to defeat an opponent. One must demonize, disgrace, and destroy him. The tradition of political foes being social friends when the sun goes down maintained by Speaker of the House Sam Rayburn when he invited Republicans to his, quote, Board of Education meetings, unquote, in his office after hours, is passé. Today, we criminalize politics and go for the throat. In January 2011, when a crazed gunman, nursing a grudge against Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords, shot her in Tucson, killed 6 others, including a 9-year-old girl and a federal judge, and wounded a dozen more, Marcos Melitsas of Daily Kos instantly tweeted, quote, "Mission accomplished, Sarah Palin," end quote. This began a week-long campaign to indict Palin and conservative commentators as moral accomplices who had set the table for mass murder by having created a, quote, climate of hate, end quote, in which the killer acted. Rather than bring the nation together in mourning, the massacre drove a new wedge between us. In February, when Governor Scott Walker proposed requiring Wisconsin state employees to contribute more than a pittance to their generous health and pension benefits, and restricting collective bargaining to wage increases no higher than the rate of inflation, the state capitol was invaded by scores of thousands of enraged and raucous demonstrators. Wildcat strikes by teachers followed, with Democratic state senators fleeing to Illinois to prevent a quorum from voting on the proposal. Yet it is not only the rancor of our politics pulling us apart. We have gone through such periods before: the Truman-McCarthy era, Vietnam, Watergate. But those turbulent periods were followed by eras of good feeling, Eisenhower JFK, and the Reagan decade that saw a rebirth of national confidence crowned in 1989 by a peaceful end to a Cold War that had lasted a half-century. Something is different today. The America we grew up in is gone. The unity and common purpose we had when we could together pledge allegiance to a flag that stood for, quote, one nation, under God, indivisible, is gone. In America today, the secession that is taking place is a secession from one another, a secession of the heart. E pluribus unum, out of many, one. That was the national motto the men of '76 settled upon. Today one sees the pluribus, but where is the unum? What happened to the center? Asked retired Congressman Lee Hamilton, a Democrat, as he returned to Indiana. Quote, the question at Gettysburg, will America remain one nation, is the operative question of today. President Carter echoed Hamilton. Quote, this country has become so polarized that it's almost astonishing. Not only with the red and blue states, President Obama suffers from the most polarized situation in Washington that we have ever seen, even maybe than the time of Abraham Lincoln and the initiation of the war between the states. End quote. 6 months after his comeback victory in 2010, Governor Jerry Brown of California was echoing his old rival Jimmy Carter. Quote, we are at a point of civil discord, and I would not minimize the risk to our country and our state. We are facing a regime crisis. The legitimacy of our very democratic institutions is in question. End quote. Barack Obama did not disagree. He had begun his presidency in what seemed a new era of good feeling, when even Fred Barnes of the Weekly Standard christened him, quote, the bearer of moral authority as our first African-American president, end quote. By Labor Day 2010, Obama was ruefully relating to an audience in Wisconsin, quote, they talk about me like a dog, end quote. This, then, is the thesis of this book. America is disintegrating. The centrifugal force pulling us apart are growing inexorably. What once united us is dissolving, and this is true of Western civilization. There is no room in this country for hyphenated Americanism, Theodore Roosevelt warned the Knights of Columbus in 1915. The one absolutely certain way of bringing this nation to ruin, of preventing all possibility of its continuing to be a nation at all, would be to permit it to become a tangle of squabbling nationalities." End quote. What Roosevelt warned us against, we have become. Meanwhile, the state is failing in its most fundamental duties. It is no longer able to defend our borders, balance our budgets, or win our wars. As the bonds of brotherhood are corroded, a crisis of democracy impends. America is running the third consecutive deficit of 10% of our gross domestic product. Unfunded liabilities of the federal government run into the scores of trillions. By Herbert Stein's law, if something cannot go on forever, it will stop. By the middle of this decade, if it does not roll back the welfare warfare state, the United States will face monetary and fiscal collapse. Already, Standard & Poor's has begun the process of downgrading U.S. debt, and global creditors are signaling that the United States may be forced to default or float its way out of this crisis with a Weimar-style inflation that destroys the dollar. In 2010, only a debt crisis in Greece and Ireland threatening the euro sent panicked investors running back to the dollar. On the news of Burgoyne's defeat at Saratoga in 1777, which portended the loss of the North American colonies, John Sinclair wrote to Adam Smith in despair that Britain was headed for ruin. Quote, "There is a great deal of ruin in a nation," replied Smith. "We are severely testing Smith's proposition." The passing of a superpower. America is in unprecedented decline. Robert Pape, 2008, The National Interest. The United States is declining as a nation and a world power, with mostly sighs and shrugs to mark this seismic event. Leslie H. Gelb, 2009, President Emeritus, the Council on Foreign Relations. At no time in human history has a nation of diminished economic vitality maintained its military and political primacy. Barack Obama, 2010. "If money isn't loosened up, this sucker is going to go down," said the President of the United States. The place was the Cabinet Room, the occasion the September 2008 meeting of Bush and the congressional leadership to persuade recalcitrant Republicans to approve a $700 billion bailout of America's imperiled banks to prevent a panic after Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson let Lehman Brothers collapse. The sucker that was going down was the global financial system. 9 months earlier, CNBC's Lawrence Kudlow, in a column titled, quote, "Bush Boom Continues," had rhapsodized about the Bush economy. You can call it Goldilocks 2.0. A few months can make quite a difference. Lost decade. This generation of Americans has been witness to one of the most stunning declines of a great power in the history of the world. In 2000, the United States ran a surplus. In 2009, it ran a deficit of $1.4 trillion, 10% of the economy. The 2010 deficit was almost equal, and the 2011 deficit was almost equal to that. The national debt is surging to 100% of GDP, portending an eventual run on the dollar, a default, or Weimar-style inflation. The greatest creditor nation in history is now the world's greatest debtor. In 2010, Republican Senator Judd Gregg, the fiscal conservative Obama wanted in his cabinet, went home to New Hampshire with a warning, quote, "This nation is on a course where if we don't get fiscal policy under control, we're Greece," unquote. Quote, "The Tea Party is in the mainstream of where political thought is right now. We've had a radical explosion in the size of government in the last 2 years. You've gone from 20% of GDP to 24% of GDP, headed toward 28% of GDP. That has to be brought under control, or we're going to bankrupt the country," unquote. According to the International Monetary Fund, America's GDP has fallen from 32% of world product in 2001 to 24%. As Leslie Gelb, President Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations, has written, "No nation with a massive debt has ever remained a great power." Quote, U.S. heavy industry has largely disappeared, having moved to foreign competitors, which has cut deeply into its ability to be independent in times of peril. Its public school students trail their peers in other industrialized countries in math and science. They cannot compete in the global economy. Generations of Americans, shockingly, read at a grade school level and know almost no history, not to mention no geography, unquote. Even the establishment has begun to get the message. Political science professor Robert Pape of the University of Chicago echoes Gelb, quote, "The self-inflicted wounds of the Iraq War, growing government debt, increasingly negative current account balances, and other internal economic weaknesses have cost the United States real power in today's world of rapidly spreading knowledge and technology. If present trends continue, we will look back at the Bush administration years as the death knell of American hegemony." End quote. When Pape correlated the rise of the 19th century powers with the growth in their shares of world product, he found America's decline in the Bush years to be almost without precedent. Quote, "America's relative decline since 2000 of some 30% represents a far greater loss of relative power in a shorter time than any power shift among European great powers from roughly the end of the Napoleonic Wars to World War II. Indeed, in size, it is clearly surpassed by only one other great power decline, the unexpected internal collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. End quote. In the first decade of what was to be the second American century, a net of 0 new jobs was created. Average households were earning less in real dollars at the end of the decade than at the beginning. The net worth of the American family in stocks, bonds, savings, home values receded 4%. 50,000 plants and factories shut down. As a source of jobs, manufacturing fell below healthcare and education in 2001, below retail sales in 2002, below local government in 2006, below leisure and hospitality, restaurants and bars, in 2008, all for the first time. Be it shoes, clothes, cars, furniture, radios, TVs, appliances, bicycles, toys, cameras, computers, we buy from abroad what we used to make here. Our economic independence is history. In April 2010, 3 of every 4 Americans, 74%, said the country is weaker than a decade ago, and 57% said life in America will be worse for the next generation than it is today. Who did this to us? We did it to ourselves. We abandoned economic nationalism for globalism. We cast aside fiscal prudence for partisan bidding for voting blocs. We ballooned our welfare state to rival the socialist states of Europe. We invited the world to come and partake of the feast. And we launched a crusade for democracy that has us tied down in 2 decade-long wars. What globalization wrought. In 2009, Paul Volcker, former chairman of the Federal Reserve, told Congress the cause of the financial crisis was trade-related imbalances. Pressed by Senator Chris Dodd, Volcker added, quote, "Go back to the imbalances in the economy. The United States has been consuming more than it has been producing for many years." End quote. Starting in the 1980s and accelerating with NAFTA and GATT, the United States set out to meld its economy with those of Europe and Japan and create a global economy. We decided to create the interdependent world envisioned by such 19th century dreamers as David Ricardo, Richard Cobden, Frederick Bastiat, and John Stuart Mill. That experiment did not work out well for the free trade British in the 19th century, who were shouldered aside in the struggle for world primacy by America. But our generation would make it work for the world. What happened was predictable and was, in fact, predicted. With the abolition of tariffs and with U.S. guarantees that goods made in foreign countries would enter America free of charge, manufacturers began to shut plants here and move production abroad to countries where U.S. wage and hour laws and health, safety, and environmental regulations did not apply, countries where there were no unions and workers' wages were below the U.S. minimum wage. Competitors who stayed in America were undercut and run out of business or forced to join the stampede abroad. After Japan and Europe had carted off their shares of the U.S. market, the tigers of Asia queued up: South Korea, Taiwan, Malaysia, and Singapore. But the big winner was Beijing. In 1994, China made a brilliant strategic move. She devalued her currency 45%, cutting in half the already cheap cost of labor for companies relocating to China, and doubling the price of U.S. goods entering China. The result? Those imbalances to which Volcker referred. For decades, Japan's trade surplus with the United States was the largest on Earth. In the 21st century, China's trade surplus with the United States began to dwarf Japan's. In 2008, China exported 5 times the dollar volume of goods to America as she imported, and her trade surpluses with America set a world record between any two nations: $266 billion. In August 2010, China's trade surplus with the United States set a new all-time monthly record of $28 billion and was headed for a new annual record. Nor was this trade surplus all in toys and textiles. In critical items that the Commerce Department defines as advanced technology products, the United States trade deficit with China in 2010 hit a record $95 billion. During President Bush's 8 years, total trade deficits with China in advanced technology products exceeded $300 billion. China today has the trade profile of an industrial and technological power, while the manifest of U.S. exports to China, aircraft accepted, reads like the exports of the Jamestown colonies back to the mother country. What was the impact of this tsunami of imports on employment? During the first decade of the 21st century, U.S. semiconductors and electronic component producers lost 42% of their jobs. Communications equipment producers lost 48% of their jobs. Textile and apparel producers lost, respectively, 63% and 61% of their jobs. In that same first decade of the 21st century, the United States issued 10,300,000 green cards inviting foreigners to come compete for the remaining jobs of U.S. workers. In fiscal 2009 alone, the first full year of massive layoffs and soaring unemployment in the Great Recession, 1,130,000 green cards were issued, with 808,000 going to permanent immigrants of working age. What in the name of patriotism are we doing to our own people? At every election, politicians decry America's deepening dependence on foreign oil, but the U.S. trade deficit in manufacturing, $440 billion in 2008, was $89 billion larger than the U.S. deficit in crude oil. Why is our dependence on the oil of Canada, Mexico, Venezuela, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf states a greater concern than our dependence on computers and vital components of our high-tech industries and weapon systems produced by a rival power run by a communist Politburo? As Augie Tantillo, executive director of the American Manufacturing Trade Action Committee, argues, quote, Running a trade deficit for natural resources that the United States lacks is something that cannot be helped, but running a massive trade deficit in man-made products that America easily could produce itself is a choice. A poor choice that is bankrupting the country and responsible for the loss of millions of jobs. What have been the consequences for our country of these trade imbalances? The deindustrialization of America, a growing dependence on China for the necessities of our national life and the loans to pay for them, a loss of millions of the best jobs Americans ever had, a median wage and family income that have been stagnant for a decade, a steep decline in the global purchasing power of the dollar, a loss of national dynamism, and a debt bomb that went off in our face in September 2008, and permanent peril to our national security. As South Carolina's Fritz Hollings, the economic patriot of the Senate for 4 decades, writes, quote, "The defense industry has been offshored. We had to wait months to get flat panel displays from Japan before we launched Desert Storm. Boeing can't build a fighter plane except for the parts from India. Sikorsky can't build a helicopter except for the tail motor from Turkey. Today we can't go to war except for the favor of a foreign country." The fruits of free trade. Though Bush 41 and Bush 43 often disagreed, one issue united them and Bill Clinton: protectionism. Globalists all, they rejected any measure to protect America's manufacturing base or the wages of U.S. workers. They enacted NAFTA, created the World Trade Organization, abolished tariffs, and granted China unrestricted access to the U.S. market. Charles W. McMillan of MBG Information Services has compiled the results of 2 decades of this Bush-Clinton-Bush embrace of globalism. His compilation might be entitled, quote, "An Index of the Decline and Fall of Industrial America," end quote. Here are McMillan's statistics. From December 2000 through December 2010, U.S. industrial production fell for the first time since the Depression, and America lost over 3 million private sector jobs, the worst record since 1928 to 1938. In that same decade, 5.5 million U.S. manufacturing jobs, 1 of every 3 we had, disappeared. Manufacturing, 27% of the U.S. economy in 1950, is now down to 11% and accounts for only 9% of the non-farm labor force. In traded goods, we ran up $6.2 trillion in deficits, $3.8 trillion of that in manufactured goods. The Bush II era was the first in U.S. history in which government began to employ more workers than manufacturing. U.S. trade surpluses and advanced technology products ended in Bush's first term. From 2007 through 2010, the United States ran trade deficits in advanced technology products totaling $300 billion with China alone. The cumulative U.S. trade deficit with China in manufactured goods was $2 trillion. China now holds the mortgage on America. From December 2000 to December 2010, New York and Ohio lost 38% of their manufacturing jobs. Over the same period, New Jersey lost 39% and Michigan lost 48%. The cumulative current account deficit of the United States from year 2000 through the third quarter of 2010 exceeded $6 trillion. To finance it, we had to borrow $1.5 billion abroad every single day for 10 years. Stephen Moore contrasts the America of 2011 with a country some of us still remember. Quote, "Today in America, there are nearly twice as many people working for the government, 22.5 million, than in all of manufacturing, 11.5 million. This is almost an exact reversal of the situation in 1960, when there were 15 million workers in manufacturing and 8.7 million collecting a paycheck from the government." End quote. "More Americans work for the government," writes Moore, "than work in construction, farming, fishing, forestry, manufacturing, mining, and utilities combined. We have moved decisively from a nation of makers to a nation of takers." End quote. This is our reward for turning our backs on the economic nationalism of the men who made America, and embracing the free trade ideology of economists and academics who never made anything. In early 2010, it was reported that Detroit, forge and furnace of the arsenal of democracy in World War II, was considering razing a fourth of the city and turning it into pasture land. Did that $1.2 trillion trade deficit we ran in autos and auto parts in the Bush 43 decade help to kill Detroit? If our purpose in negotiating NAFTA was to assist Mexico, consider this. Textile and apparel imports from China are now 5 times the dollar value of those same imports from Mexico and Canada combined. America's trade deficits are, quote, "selling the nation out from under us," end quote, said Warren Buffett back in 2003. U.S. trade deficits that have averaged $500 to $600 billion a year for 10 years represent the single greatest wealth transfer in history and the single greatest factor raising China up and pulling America down. As astonishing as these indices of American decline is the feckless indifference of our political class. How to explain it? Ignorance of history is surely one answer. Every nation that rose to world power did so by protecting and nurturing its manufacturing base, from Great Britain under the Acts of Navigation, to the United States from the Civil War to the Roaring Twenties, to Bismarck's Germany before World War I, to post-war Japan, to China today. No nation rose to power on free trade. From Britain after 1860 to America after 1960, free trade has been the policy of powers that put consumption before production and today before tomorrow. The historical record is clear. Nations rise on economic nationalism. They descend on free trade. Ideology is another explanation. Even a Milton Friedmanite free trader should be able to see the disaster around us and to ask, what benefit did our country receive from these mountains of imported goods, and was that benefit great enough to justify the terrible damage done to our economic independence and vitality? Cannot the free trade ideologue see the direct correlation between trade deficits and national decline? Free trade, mocked Henry Clay, architect of the American system, in the great tariff debate of 1832-33. To Clay, the benefits of free trade were illusory. Quote, "The call for free trade is as unavailing as the cry of a spoiled child in its nurse's arms for the moon or stars that glitter in the firmament of heaven. It never existed. It never will exist." End quote. Instead of liberating America, free trade would, said Clay, place us, quote, "under the commercial domination of Great Britain." End quote. We have spurned the economic patriotism of Hamilton, Jackson, Clay, Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, and Coolidge to embrace free trade. And so it is that we now find ourselves under the commercial domination of the People's Republic of China. What happened to us? How did the republic that came through a depression to win World War II, rebuild Europe and Japan, put a man on the moon, lead the world into an age of prosperity, and triumph over the Soviet Empire after half a century of Cold War, come to this? Where did we make the wrong turn? How did we lose our way? How, in a generation, did we reach a point where a majority of our people believe America is headed in the wrong direction, that our children will not know the good life their parents had, that the American dream may never become reality for scores of millions of our countrymen? The answer? The failure of our system is rooted in a societal failure. We are not ruled by the same ideas, nor do we possess the same moral character as our parents did. Today, freedom takes a back seat to equality. One nation under God, indivisible, has become an antique concept in an age that celebrates diversity and multiculturalism. Our intellectual and cultural elites reject the God our parents believed in and the moral code they lived by. Our fathers warned that should this happen, the republic would fall. Quote, "Virtue, morality, and religion," said Patrick Henry. "This is the armor, my friend, and this alone that renders us invincible. If we lose these, we are conquered, fallen indeed." End quote. "'Tis substantially true," said Washington, "that virtue or morality is a necessary spring of popular government." And the source of virtue and morality, Washington believed, was religion. Quote, "Let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness, these firmest props of the duties of man and citizens." End quote. Tocqueville found that Americans half a century later still shared Washington's conviction that religion was the pillar of the republic. Quote, "I do not know whether all Americans have a sincere faith in their religion, for who can search the human heart, but I am certain that they hold it to be indispensable for the maintenance of republican institutions. This opinion is not peculiar to a class of citizens or a party, but it belongs to the whole nation and every rank of society." End quote. "Our ancestors," said Daniel Webster in his famous Plymouth Rock speech of 1820, "established their system of government on morality and religious sentiment. Moral habits, they believed, cannot safely be on any other foundation than religious principle, nor any government be secure which is not supported by moral habits." End quote. Religion is the foundation of morality, and only a moral people can sustain a free republic, these men were asserting. Without religion, morality withers and dies. The community disintegrates, the nation falls. Our fathers' insight goes far toward explaining the current crisis of the republic, for America has ceased to be the Christian country they and we grew up in. The death of Christian America. America was born a Christian nation, Woodrow Wilson. This is a Christian nation, Harry Truman, 1947. We do not consider ourselves a Christian nation, Barack Obama, 2009. At the 2009 inaugural, the official prayer was offered by Rick Warren, pastor of Saddleback Church in Orange County, California, and author of The Purpose-Driven Life, which had sold 30 million copies. Warren, who had been attacked for his support of California's Proposition 8, a constitutional amendment that outlawed same-sex marriage, closed his prayer thusly, quote, "I humbly ask this in the name of the one who changed my life, Yeshua, Isa, Jesus, Jesus, who taught us to pray, Our Father who art in heaven." Many Christians were startled that Pastor Warren did not identify Jesus as the Son of God, but did identify him by his Muslim name, Isa. For Islam teaches that God had no son, that Isa was not God, but a prophet superseded by Muhammad. Warren seemed to be implying that Islam's view of Jesus, a view that denies Jesus' divinity, was acceptable to him. President Obama followed Warren and repudiated the notion that America is a Christian nation. Quote, We are a nation of Christians and Muslims, Jews and Hindus and non-believers." End quote. For the first time, a president had denied the primacy of Christianity in America. The Supreme Court had declared in 1892, quote, "This is a Christian nation," end quote. The president was now declaring in his inaugural that we had ceased to be so. The age of Obama marks the advent of post-Christian America. In his inaugural benediction, Reverend Joseph Lowery sustained the theme of inclusiveness and extended it from every religion to every race. Quote, "Lord, we ask you to help us work for that day when black will not be asked to get in back, when brown can stick around, when yellow will be mellow, when the red man can get a head man, and when white will embrace what is right." End quote. The next morning, Reverend Dr. Sharon Watkins, General President of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, a member of the Central Committee of the World Council of Churches, strode to the pulpit of Washington National Cathedral as the first woman ever to deliver the homily at the National Prayer Service. Determined to be ecumenical, Watkins began with an old Cherokee tale about wolves and wisdom, then pivoted to the Old Testament, saying, quote, "In the later chapters of Isaiah, in the 500s BCE, the prophet speaks," end quote. BCE? The initials are used by those who wish to be rid of BC, before Christ. For centuries, the civilized world has divided history into BC and AD, Anno Domini, in the year of the Lord. BCE stands for before the Common Era, before the Current Era, or before the Christian Era. Secularists seek to replace BC with BCE and AD with CE for Common Era in all historical references, thus eliminating Christ and Christianity as the pivot of world history. After relating the Cherokee tale of the good wolf and the fearful wolf, Reverend Watkins proceeded to ask, "So how do we go about loving God?" Well, according to Isaiah, summed up by Jesus, affirmed by a worldwide community of Muslim scholars and many others, it is by facing hard times with a generous heart, by reaching out toward each other rather than by turning our backs on each other. As Mahatma Gandhi once said, "People can be so poor that the only way they see God is in a piece of bread." This was the sole mention of Jesus. Jesus was not identified as the Son of God or the Redeemer of mankind, but as the fellow who had, quote, "summed up Isaiah." Reverend Watkins' sermon, Harmonies of Liberty, went on to cite Emma Lazarus, Martin Luther King, Obama, and Catherine Lee Bates, author of America the Beautiful, who had lived controversially for 25 years with fellow Wellesley professor Dr. Catherine Coleman. She closed by reciting the final verses of James Weldon Johnson's "Lift Every Voice and Sing," which has been called the Negro National Anthem. To Christians, Christ is the Son of God. Through him alone can we come to the Father and attain salvation. Yet Reverend Watkins all but excluded her Lord and his message of salvation when she had a worldwide audience, preferring to take her parable from a Cherokee tale. The Obama inauguration symbolized the dilution and decline of a once muscular Christianity that had guided American public life for 2 centuries. The gods of modernity. Quote, "When we cease to worship God, we do not then worship nothing, we worship anything." End quote. That is an insight attributed to British author G.K. Chesterton. A third consequence when Christianity dies in the soul is that people seek a new God to worship, a new explanation for life, a new reason for living, a new cause to believe in, live for, die for. When faith dies, something else will come to occupy the empty place in the heart. As nature abhors a vacuum, so too does the heart of man. Quote, "All men need the gods," end quote, said the ancient Greek poet Homer. And if the god of Sinai and god of Calvary is dead, men will find new gods or create them, as Hebrews wandering in the desert created a golden calf and fell down to worship it. We saw the results of that search in the last century. Quote, "If you will not have God, and he is a jealous God," wrote T.S. Eliot, "you should pay your respects to Hitler or Stalin." Tens of millions did. Whittaker Chambers, the American communist who spied for the Soviet Union and then recanted and converted to Christianity, explained in his 1952 book Witness Marxism's appeal to the educated young of the Depression. It was the appeal of the second oldest faith. Quote, "Its promise was whispered in the first days of the creation under the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Oldest as gods. It is the great alternative faith of mankind. Like all great faiths, its force derives from a simple vision. The communist vision is the vision of man without God." End quote. Writing of Chambers' insight about the second oldest faith, author Wayne Allensworth lists other gods that have captured souls in our time. Quote, "Chambers captured the spiritual roots of what was made manifest in one form as communism, in others as the hydra of radicalism that has haunted mankind since the expulsion from Eden, whether as the sexual obsession of the libertines, feminists, and militant homosexuals, the growing power of Leviathan and bureaucracy, or the ruthlessness of global capitalism and self-absorbed consumerism." End quote. Ideology came first to capture the souls in which Christianity had died. As Europe lost the old faith, new faiths arose, communism and Nazism to combat it. In Britain, the religion to counter Nazism was nationalism, the religion of patriotism. But while nationalism unites countrymen, it divides countries, and the wars these secular religions produced prove more terrible than the Christian wars of the 16th and 17th centuries. These were the false gods that failed in apostate Europe when she lost the faith that had given her birth. And it was when we learned the truth of Psalm 96, quote, "All the gods of the Gentiles are devils," unquote. Dawson saw in democracy, socialism, and nationalism secular man's search to rediscover his sense of the sacred. Quote, "Democracy bases its appeal on the sacredness of the people, the consecration of folk. Socialism on the sacredness of labor, the consecration of work, and nationalism on the sacredness of the fatherland, the consecration of place. These concepts still arouse a genuine religious emotion, though the emotion has no basis in transcendent religious values or sanctions. It is a religious emotion divorced from religious belief." End quote. Neoconservatism, which shares attributes with the Trotskyism that is one of its roots, is one of the new ideologies to have seized the imagination of those seeking a cause with its, quote, "belief in struggle, the utopian notion of a moral society at the end of history, and most importantly, a romantic belief in the power of ideas and morality to change the world." End quote. The conversion of George W. Bush to neoconservatism was not without consequence. Conservative scholar Robert Nisbet identified yet another new religion. Quote, "It is entirely possible that when the history of the 20th century is finally written, the single most important social movement of the period will be judged to be environmentalism. Environmentalism is now well on its way to becoming the third great wave of redemptive struggle in Western history, the first being Christianity, the second modern socialism." End quote. By sacrificing to save our planet, Mother Earth, Gaia, millions believe we redeem ourselves and save our souls. This effort to recover a lost sense of the sacred is truly, quote, "religious emotion divorced from religious belief," end quote. Other new faiths have lately appeared: New Age, Wicca, Santeria, Scientology. The occult is making a comeback. Young people flock to books and films about ghosts, vampires, and creatures from other planets in a seemingly endless search for the transcendent. Others seek community and a cause to believe in by joining with those of the same sexual orientation. In the 18th century, Samuel Johnson called patriotism the last refuge of a scoundrel. It is also the first refuge of many without faith. This, too, must ultimately prove futile, for as Belloc said, self-worship is not enough. Yet the self, too, has become a deity. For more than anything else today, individualism, hedonism, and materialism move Western man. At the Oscar ceremony in 2009, comedian and atheist Bill Maher jibed that, quote, "Our silly gods cost the world too greatly," end quote. "He's absolutely right," replied columnist Rod Dreher. "Our silly gods have cost the world too greatly." Quote, "The god of hedonism and sexual indulgence has given us a world of broken marriages, shattered families, the destruction of the traditional family, miserable deaths from AIDS, epidemic teen pregnancy, fatherless children, and the social, even criminal dysfunction that accompanies such, and a younger generation unmoored from sexual sanity. The god of money which rules Wall Street in Washington has delivered the world to a present and future calamity that will cause suffering not seen in at least a century." End quote. "The truth Maher may never recognize," wrote Dreher, "is not that God has failed us, but that we have failed him." End quote. Times' 1966 Easter cover raised the question, is God dead? Yet the search for God never ends, and when traditional faiths fail to satisfy the searchers, new cults arise. 900 cult members perished in the mass suicide in Jonestown, Guyana, where charismatic pastor Jim Jones had moved his flock from San Francisco. In the 1990s, members of the Heaven's Gate cult in San Diego committed collective suicide to seek God in outer space. In 1993, 24 children and scores of adult followers of David Koresh's Branch Davidian sect perished or were murdered in the inferno that erupted when FBI agents ended their siege and attacked the compound outside Waco, Texas. However, the greatest rival to a fading Christianity may be an ancient rival. In the year of Munich, 1938, while the world was preoccupied with a potential world war between fascism, Bolshevism, and democracy, Belloc, with startling clarity of vision, looked to a somnolent south and saw an ancient adversary stirring again. Quote, "It has always seemed to me possible and even probable that there would be a resurrection of Islam, and that our sons or our grandsons would see the renewal of that tremendous struggle between the Christian culture and what has been for more than 1,000 years its greatest opponent." End quote. But how could a quiescent Islamic world imperil Western civilization? What did that backwater world have that modern Europe did not? The tenacity of its belief in God. Here is Belloc again. Quote, "In Islam, there has been no dissolution of ancestral doctrine, nothing corresponding to the universal breakup of religion in Europe. The whole spiritual strength of Islam is still present in the masses of Syria and Anatolia, of the East Asian mountains, of Arabia, Egypt, and North Africa. The final fruit of this tenacity, the second period of Islamic power, may be delayed, but I doubt whether it can be permanently postponed." End quote. These prophetic words were written 70 years ago, when most of the Islamic world was under the boot of Europe. Islam, said Belloc, is, quote, "the most formidable and persistent enemy which our civilization has had, and may at any moment become as large a menace in the future as it has been in the past." End quote. Half a century after Belloc wrote, Harvard's Samuel Huntington would be credited by Fuad Ajami with, quote, remarkable prescience, foreseeing in his Clash of Civilization what Belloc saw in 1938. Quote, the relations between Islam and Christianity have often been stormy. Each has been the other's other. The 20th century conflict between liberal democracy and Marxist-Leninism is only a fleeting and superficial historical phenomenon compared to the continuing and deeply conflictual relation between Islam and Christianity. End quote. The end of white America. The new America in the 21st century will be primarily non-white, a place that George Washington would not recognize. John Hope Franklin, African-American historian. Obama's victory creates the prospect of a new real America. It is no longer a white country. Joe Klein, November 5, 2008. Demographically, economically, and geopolitically, white America is in decline. The Nation, 2009. Quote, civilization's going to pieces. I've gotten to be a terrible pessimist about things, said Tom Buchanan. Have you read The Rise of the Colored Empires by this man Goddard? Tom's friends had not. Well, it's a fine book, and everybody ought to read it. The idea is if we don't look out, the white race will be utterly submerged. It's all scientific stuff. It's been proved. End quote. This scene from Scott Fitzgerald's Great Gatsby introduces, quote, the end of white America, a long essay in the Atlantic Monthly by music critic and Vassar professor Hua Su. Quote, this man Goddard appears to be a composite of Henry Goddard, Madison Grant, and Lothrop Stoddard. Goddard was a eugenicist who translated the Binet intelligence test into English, introduced the word moron to the field of intelligence testing, and wrote the first law requiring that mentally challenged children be given special education. Grant authored The Passing of the Great Race, which separated Caucasians into Nordic, Alpine, and Mediterranean peoples, with the Nordic being the superior stock. As this following raw passage reveals, Grant was deep into eugenics. Quote, mistaken regard for what are believed to be divine laws and a sentimental belief in the sanctity of human life tend to prevent both the elimination of defective infants and sterilization of such adults as are themselves of no value in the community. The laws of nature require the obliteration of the unfit, and human life is valuable only when it is of use to the community or race. End quote. Pure social Darwinism. Stoddard authored The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy, which warned that the carnage of what he called the White Civil War of 1914 to 1918 and the population explosion in Asia and Africa meant Europeans were facing racial inundation, the loss of world supremacy, and the death of their civilization. Quote, colored migration is a universal peril, menacing every part of the white world, period, unquote. Yet, wrote Hua Su, the rising tide of color is eerily serene, scholarly, and gentlemanly, its hatred rationalized and, in Tom Buchanan's term, scientific. Published by Scribner's, the book was a phenomenon. Ivy League educated, Grant and Stoddard were respected in academic circles and belonged to an elite that supported the eugenics movement, Margaret Sanger, and sterilization laws. Stoddard, though unashamedly racialist, was something of a prophet. He predicted Japan's rise to power, its war with the United States, a second European war, the fall of the Western empires, mass migration of peoples of color to the West, and the rise of Islam as a threat to Western civilization. What Tom Buchanan and Goddard feared Professor Sue welcomes, quote, "The end of white America is a cultural and demographic inevitability." According to the 2010 census, white Americans will be a minority in 2041. Among those under 18, whites will become a minority in 2019. Every American child born after 2001 belongs to a generation more third world than European. Questions about the future arise. If the end of white America is a cultural and demographic inevitability, quote, what will the new mainstream of America look like, and what ideas or values might it rally around? What will it mean to be white after whiteness no longer defines the mainstream? Will anyone mourn the end of white America? Will anyone try to preserve it? So writes Hua Su. One reaction the professor reports is that among cultural elites, some are shedding their white identity. Quote, if white America is losing control, and if the future will belong to people who can successfully navigate a post-racial, multicultural landscape, then it's no surprise that many white Americans are eager to divest themselves of their whiteness entirely. End quote. Indeed, who would want to be numbered among stupid white men, the title of Michael Moore's 2002 bestseller about a people oblivious to what is happening to them? The day after Obama's inaugural, television host Larry King blurted out to an uneasy Bob Woodward a secret desire of his son. Quote, my younger son, Cannon, is 8, and he now says he would like to be black. I'm not kidding. He says there's a lot of advantages. Black is in. Is this a turning of the tide? End quote. Quote, this is the decade of Tiger Woods and Barack Obama, of race combinations, end quote, says U.S. Census Bureau head Robert Groves, who looked ahead with excitement to the 2010 figures. Quote, I can't wait to see the pattern of responses on multiple races. That'll be a neat indicator to watch. End quote. Professor Su cites examples to make his case that in the popular culture it is now unhip to be white, and artists are seeking to escape any white identity. Quote, successful network television shows like Lost, Heroes, and Grey's Anatomy feature wildly diverse casts, and an entire genre of half-hour comedy from The Colbert Report to The Office seems dedicated to having fun with the persona of the clueless white male. The youth market is following the same pattern. Pop culture today rallies around an ethic of multicultural inclusion that seems to value every identity except whiteness. Quote, it's becoming harder for the blonde-haired, blue-eyed commercial actor, unquote, remarks Rochelle Newman Carrasco of the Hispanic marketing firm Enlace. End quote. One gets the drift. But while the Music Man cites artists embarrassed by their white identity, he also sees the white working class seceding into social cultural enclaves like Nashville and NASCAR. Quote, the core grievance of this emerging minority has to do with cultural and socio-economic dislocation, the sense that the system that used to guarantee the white working class some stability has gone off-kilter. End quote. Here the professor was dead on target. The Tea Party and town hall protests of 2009 were almost wholly white affairs. Mocking them, Rich Benjamin, author of Searching for Whitopia, An Improbable Journey to the Heart of White America, explains what these folks fear. Quote, by 2042, whites will no longer be the American majority. This demographic projection sounds a frightening alarm to the likes of Joe Wilson. It heralds significant change to our nation's culture, electoral politics, and distribution of resources. We must understand Wilson's outburst by exposing its past and future context, including what I call, quote, the white people deadline, 2042, end quote. Benjamin's book reads like a Baedeker to the bolt holes to which whites are fleeing to huddle as multiracial America approaches. During the Sergeant Crowley Professor Gates dust-up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Obama's subsequent beer summit, New York Times columnist Frank Rich also cited the year 2042, noting the fears it had engendered. Quote, "That reaction to Gatesgate is merely the latest example of how the inexorable transformation of America into a white minority country in some 30 years, by 2042 in the latest Census Bureau estimates, is causing serious jitters, if not panic, in the white establishments. We're just at the start of what may be a 30-year struggle. Beer won't cool the fury of those who can't accept the reality that America's racial profile will no longer reflect their own." End quote. When Tea Party activists raucously protested outside the Capitol as Democrats passed Obama's health care bill, Rich saw visions of Kristallnacht, the Nazi pogrom against the Jews in 1938, and race as, quote, "the real source of the over-the-top rage," end quote. By 2012, Rich wrote, quote, "non-Hispanic white births will be in the minority. The Tea Party movement is virtually all white. Their anxieties about a rapidly changing America are well-grounded," end quote. "For what is coming is, quote, a national existential reordering, unseen since the Civil Rights Act of 1964 made, quote, some Americans run off the rails," end quote. With the Tea Party triumph in 2010, Tim Wise of the Daily Kos, in a piece titled "The Last Gasp of Aging White Power," wrote that this victory by white folks is but a battle won by a dying tribe in a lost war. Quote, "For all y'all rich folks, enjoy that champagne, or whatever fancy-ass scotch you drink, and for all y'all a bit lower on the economic scale, enjoy your Pabst Blue Ribbon, or whatever shitty-ass beer you favor. Whatever the case and whatever your economic station, know this: you need to drink up, and quickly and heavily, because your time is limited, real damned limited. So party while you can, but mind the increasingly loud clock ticking away in the corners of your consciousness, the clock that reminds you how little time you and yours have left." End quote. Listening to Larry King and reading Rich Benjamin and Hua Su, one is reminded of the comment of 1960s essayist James Baldwin of the Fire Next Time fame. Quote, "As long as you think you're white, there's no hope for you." End quote. On MSNBC's Morning Joe on Inauguration Day, Tom Brokaw saw in Obama's triumph payback for white bigotry Brokaw had witnessed. Quote, "Having been in the South in the 60s in Los Angeles, in Watts and northern urban areas, when we were evolving as a country, I'm thinking of all the bigots and the rednecks and all the people I met along the way. I'm saying to them, take this." Robert Reich seemed to be of a similar cast of mind. When Obama's stimulus bill came before Congress, the former Secretary of Labor, now a Berkeley professor, testified to his hopes as to who should benefit and who should not. Quote, "I am concerned, as I'm sure many of you are, that these jobs not simply go to high-skilled people who are already professionals or to white male construction workers. I have nothing against white male construction workers. I'm just saying there are other people who have needs as well." Unquote. Reich got his wish. By mid-2009, unemployment among women had reached 8%, but among men it was 10.5%, the largest gap ever recorded by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Among male construction workers, unemployment rose in the Great Recession to 19.7%, while illegal aliens held 17% of all construction jobs, up from 10% in 2003. In October 2010, the Washington Post reported that from July 1, 2009 to July 1, 2010, foreign-born Hispanics gained 98,000 construction jobs, while U.S.-born Hispanics lost 133,000. black and white construction workers lost 511,000 jobs that same year. In the second quarter of 2010, foreign-born workers gained 656,000 jobs. Native-born workers lost 1.2 million jobs. Economist Mark Perry called it, quote, the Great Man-cession, a wiping out of construction and manufacturing jobs, which have a high concentration of blue-collar workers, mostly white men. Politico's David Paul Kuhn wrote, quote, millions of white men who voted for Barack Obama are walking away from the Democratic Party, and it appears increasingly likely that they'll take the election in November with them. Kuhn noted that blue-collar men had suffered 57% of all losses in the recession. Quote, and blue-collar white men, who make up only 11% of the workforce, constitute 36% of those who have lost jobs. End quote. Sensing their country slipping away and their abandonment by their own elites, middle and working-class whites have turned to talk show hosts and television commentators Rush Limbaugh and Glenn Beck, as well as Sarah Palin. But the demoralization is deep. Just 9 months into Obama's presidency, a survey by the National Journal found that a plurality of white Americans over 30 not only had lost confidence in Wall Street and corporate America, but in the U.S. government. Ron Brownstein of National Journal wrote, quote, in November 2010, the Democratic Party sustained its worst off-year defeat since before World War II, losing 63 seats and control of the House. Whites made up more than 3/4 of the electorate and voted 62 to 38 for the Republicans. In the South, the white vote went Republican 73 to 27. There is now only one white Democratic congressman left in South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. White Democrats from the Deep South are close to extinct. In 2011, the Washington Post reported on the alienation and despair of the white worker in America. If there is, quote, an epicenter of financial stress and frustration, it is among whites without college degrees, end quote, said the Post. Only 14% of these Americans thought that Obama's policies were helping the economy. 56% said America's best days were behind her. 61% said it would be a long time before recovery came, and 64% blamed the government in Washington. Equality or freedom. Quote, equality of condition is incompatible with civilization. James Fenimore Cooper. Utopias of equality are biologically doomed. Will and Ariel Durant, 1968. Inequality is rooted in the biological nature of man. Murray Rothbard, 1973. Quote, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, wrote Jefferson, in one of the most quoted sentences in the English language. On the Gettysburg battlefield in 1863, Lincoln hearkened back to Jefferson's words. 67 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Unquote. In our civil religion, this is sacred text. Barack Obama invoked the creed in his inaugural. Quote, the time has come to carry forward that precious gift, that noble idea passed on from generation to generation, the God-given promise that all are equal, all are free, and all deserve a chance to pursue their full measure of happiness. End quote. Americans are taught that unlike blood and soil nations, ours is a propositional nation, an ideological nation built upon ideas. What makes us exceptional, what gives purpose to our national existence, is that America has been dedicated from birth to the advancement of equality and democracy for ourselves and all mankind. From 1776 on, said Lincoln, we have been, quote, dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal." End quote. So our children are taught. To question the belief that America is and has always been about equality, democracy, and diversity is to mark oneself down as almost un-American. Yet this rendition of American history is a myth, as great as that of the Aeneid, where the surviving hero of the sack of Troy sails the Mediterranean in exile to become founding father of Rome. Today's egalitarian drive to make us all equal is no fulfillment of the vision of the Founding Fathers. Indeed, it is the thesis of this chapter that America is embarked on an ideological crusade to achieve a utopian goal, that we will inevitably fail, and that in the process we shall ruin our country. What the Fathers believed. The Founding Fathers did not believe in democracy. They did not believe in diversity. They did not believe in equality. From what Jefferson wrote and the Fathers signed, it is clear that the only equality to which they subscribed, as an ideal and an aspiration, was an equality of God-given rights. Quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." End quote. Governments, wrote Jefferson, are formed to secure these rights, and when they fail to do so, they render themselves illegitimate, and the people have a right to rise up, overthrow those governments, and institute a new government based upon the consent of the people. Quote, "To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government." End quote. This is the idea that has inspired mankind. To extract, quote, "all men are created equal," unquote, from the context in which it was written, or assert it as an endorsement of an egalitarian society, is to distort what Jefferson wrote and what the men of Philadelphia believed. Lest we forget, this was a declaration of independence, and in its closing words, the Founding Fathers tell the world what they and the war are truly all about. Quote, "We therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress assembled, do in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right, ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved." End quote. What made these men heroes was not Jefferson's phrase about an equality of rights, but his blazing indictment of the king as a tyrant on the order of Ivan the Terrible, and his assertion that Americans no longer owed him allegiance. The men of '76 put their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor on the line to overthrow British rule. Many would pay with their fortunes and lives for this act of treason. From birth, America was the party of liberty. Égalité, on the other hand, was what the French Revolution claimed to be about. No American war was fought for egalitarian ends, post-war propaganda notwithstanding. The War of 1812 was waged against the mother of parliaments in de facto alliance with the greatest despot of the age, Napoleon Bonaparte. It was about vindicating the rights of our citizens and seizing Canada. The Texas War of 1835 was fought for independence from an autocratic and Catholic Mexico. How could it have been about equality when the Lone Star Republic that emerged from that war became the second slave nation in North America? No one would suggest the Indian wars were about equality. They were about conquest and subjugation. As we shall see from Lincoln's own words, the Civil War was about restoring the Union. The Spanish-American War was fought to avenge the sinking of the Maine and drive the Spanish out of Cuba. It ended with our annexation of Puerto Rico, Hawaii, Guam, and the Philippines. In the Philippines, we conducted the most unjust war in American history to deny Filipinos, who had trusted us, their right to be free and independent. World War I was not fought to make the world safe for democracy, but to crush the Kaiser's Germany. We did not declare war until German U-boats began to sink our merchant ships carrying war material to Britain. And America, herself by then an empire, fought as an associated power beside 5 empires: the British, French, Russian, Japanese, and Italian. At war's end, the German and Ottoman empires and their millions of subjects were divided up among the victorious imperial powers, with Woodrow Wilson's blessing. As for World War II, how could we have been fighting for democracy when we did not go to war until Japan attacked us and Hitler declared war on us? Our ally who did most of the fighting and dying was the Soviet Union of Stalin, Hitler's partner in starting the war, and a monstrous tyrant whose victims before the war began outnumbered Hitler's 1,000 to 1. Were Hamburg, Dresden, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki about bringing democracy to Germany or Japan, or annihilating the Third Reich and the Empire of Japan? Inequality is natural. Historians Will and Ariel Durant, authors of an 11-volume series of monumental books written over 4 decades, The Story of Civilization, arrived at the opposite conclusion. In the Lessons of History, the Durants conclude, quote, "Nature has not read very carefully the American Declaration of Independence or the French Revolutionary Declaration of the Rights of Man." End quote. Begin quote. "We are all born unfree and unequal, subject to our physical and psychological heredity, and to the customs and traditions of our group, diversely endowed in health and strength, in mental capacity and qualities of character. Nature loves differences as the necessary material of selection and evolution. Identical twins differ in 100 ways, and no 2 peas are alike. Inequality, quote, is not only natural and inborn, it grows with the complexity of civilization." End quote. In refutation of everything LBJ had said at Howard, the Durants declare, quote, "Nature smiles at the union of freedom and equality in our utopias. For freedom and equality are sworn and everlasting enemies, and when one prevails, the other dies. Leave men free, and their natural inequalities will multiply almost geometrically, as in England and America in the 19th century under laissez-faire. To check the growth of inequality, liberty must be sacrificed, as in Russia after 1917. End quote. Let me repeat that. To check the growth of inequality, liberty must be sacrificed. That is the point of this chapter. Where equality is enthroned, freedom is extinguished. The rise of the egalitarian society means the death of the free society. Quote, "Liberty by its very nature is inegalitarian," end quote, writes Jude Doherty, Dean Emeritus of the School of Philosophy at Catholic University. Quote, "Men differ in strength, intelligence, ambition, courage, perseverance, and all else that makes for success. There is no method to make men both free and equal." End quote. When we consider the revolutions dedicated to equality, the French Revolution of Marat and Robespierre, the Russian Revolution of Lenin and Trotsky, the Chinese Revolution of Mao, the Cuban Revolution of Castro and Che Guevara. Are the Durants not right? Is Doherty not right? The contention that men and women are equal is found in feminist ideology, not human nature. Men are bigger, stronger, more aggressive. That is why men commit crimes and are imprisoned at a rate of 10 to 1 over women. That is why men fight wars, lead armies, and build empires. Men's intelligence levels range higher and lower than those of women. Men reach heights of achievement in mathematics, science, and philosophy few women attain. Men also reach greater depths of depravity. In sports, where Americans demand the best, men and women compete separately. The first article of France's Declaration of Human Rights echoes Jefferson and Rousseau. Quote, "Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Social distinctions may be founded only upon the general good." End quote. But are infants born free? And who decides what is the general good? As for equality of rights, yes, but children are not all born equal in the ability to learn. Half are below average. 2 months into the first grade, children know they are not equal. Some are bright, others slow. Some are athletic, others are not. Some can sing, others cannot. Some girls are pretty, others plain. Quote, "So far is it from being true that men are naturally equal, that no two people can be half an hour together, but one acquires an evident superiority over the other," said Samuel Johnson. In the Old and New Testament, are all people equal? Jews were the chosen people to whom God promised the Messiah. The Son of God, his mother, and the 12 apostles were Jews. Among his disciples, Christ preferred John, elevated Peter to be the rock upon which he would build his church, and condemned Judas. In the parable of the talents, the servants are unequally endowed, and each is expected to produce consistent with his talents. If Christ taught that some are more gifted than others, the egalitarianism espoused at Howard University is in conflict with our Christian faith. Paul affirmed it in his letter to the Romans, quote, "We have gifts differing according to the grace that has been given us." End quote. The dodo. Observing the contortions ideologues go through to ensure equality of result, one is reminded of the caucus race in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Everyone, quote, "began running when they liked and left off when they liked. And when they had been running half an hour or so, the dodo suddenly called out, 'The race is over.' And they all crowded round it, panting and asking, 'But who has won?' At last the dodo said, 'Everybody has won, and all must have prizes.' The ideologue begins with an idea. All are equal and should have equal shares of the good things in life. Then proceeds to try to force society to conform to this ideal. Quote, "The ideologue," wrote Russell Kirk, "thinks of politics as a revolutionary instrument for transforming society and even transforming human nature. In the march toward utopia, the ideologue is merciless." End quote. To the ideologue adds Professor Gillis Harp of Grove City College, quote, "Facts don't matter and character assassination is permissible." End quote. The rampant use today in public discourse of terms of anathema and abuse, such as racist, sexist, and homophobe, testify to how intolerant the egalitarian is toward those who disbelieve in the core doctrine of his faith. Quote, "Utopias of equality are biologically doomed," said the Durants. "You may drive out nature with a pitchfork," said the Roman poet Horace, "yet she will always hasten back. Whether it be in sports, the arts, music, education, or politics, free and fair competition allows a natural aristocracy to assert and distinguish itself. Freedom produces a hierarchy based on intelligence, talent, and perseverance. The African-American leader W.E.B. Du Bois wrote in a 1903 essay that the highest priority of his people should be to elevate and educate that natural aristocracy, the talented tenth of Black America. Quote, "The Negro race, like all races, is going to be saved by its exceptional men. The problem of education, then, among Negroes must first of all deal with the talented tenth. It is the problem of developing the best of this race, that they may guide the mass away from the contamination and death of the worst in their own and other races." End quote. A nation dedicated to the proposition that all are equal and entitled to equal rewards must end up constantly discriminating against its talented tenth, for that is the only way a free society can guarantee social and economic equality. And consider the costs incurred, the injustices done, the freedoms curtailed, all in the name of equality. Hundreds of thousands of children have been ordered bussed out of their neighborhoods to inferior and often dangerous schools, igniting racial conflict, causing white flight, abandonment of urban schools, and the ruin of public education, a crown jewel of American civilization. The right of businesses to hire and promote based on ability and performance has been subjected for decades to policing by tens of thousands of government agents. If a labor force does not reflect gender equality or the racial composition of the community, the company may be prosecuted. Governments impose de facto race and gender quotas that add hugely to the cost of doing business. Scores of billions have been siphoned off from companies in class action lawsuits brought for alleged discrimination in one of the more lucrative rackets in American history. The top 1% of wage and salary earners now carries 40% of the entire income tax load, while the bottom 50% carry none of it. Was it not the Communist Manifesto that called for, quote, "a heavy progressive or graduated income tax," end quote? In a nation once renowned for its freedom of speech, censorship is spreading, with speech codes on campuses and hate crimes laws that punish speech offensive to the egalitarian dogma that all races, all ethnic groups, and all sexual orientations are to be equally respected. To assure equality of all religions, Christianity, our cradle faith, has been purged from the nation's public schools and public square and treated as just another religion. Universities are now required by Title IX to equalize expenditures on men's and women's sports, leading to the elimination of men's sports teams and the creation of women's teams for which there is little or no demand. Almost all men's colleges have been forced to admit women. VMI and the Citadel were forced to admit female cadets, although the schools, the alumni, and the mothers, wives, and sisters of VMI and Citadel cadets and graduates protested this judicially mandated end to their 150-year-old tradition. Men have been discriminated against so relentlessly that women with jobs now outnumber them, and men sustained 70 to 80% of all job losses in the Great Recession. Southern states must still appeal to Justice Department bureaucrats for permission to make minor changes in election laws. Dunbar High, perhaps the finest elite black high school in America, which produced generals and senators and sent a higher share of its graduates to college than any Washington, D.C. institution, was converted in the name of equality into a neighborhood school and became one of the most troubled schools in the city. In Baker v. Carr, the Supreme Court forbade all states from modeling their legislatures on Congress and mandated that all states be apportioned on population alone. Purpose? Impose one man, one vote democracy, which our fathers rejected when they gave Delaware and Rhode Island the same number of senators as Massachusetts and Virginia. In the name of equality, the Supreme Court has declared the practice of homosexuality to be a constitutional right. Vaughn Walker, a gay federal judge in San Francisco, has ruled that same-sex marriage is guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. Can anyone believe this absurd notion of equality was intended by or written into the Constitution by the Congress that produced the 14th Amendment? Although gay marriage has been rejected in 31 states in referenda, judges continue to declare that such unions be treated as marriages, an idea of equality rejected democratically by voters is being imposed dictatorially. In December 2010, a repudiated liberal Congress imposed its San Francisco values on the armed forces by ordering homosexuals admitted to all branches of the service. Indoctrination of recruits, soldiers, and officers into an acceptance of the gay lifestyle will transfer authority over the military, the most respected institution in America, to agents of a deeply resented and widely detested managerial state. To bring black and Hispanic home ownership to parity with that of whites, George W. Bush pushed banks into making millions of subprime mortgages, defaults on which may yet bring down our free enterprise system. Egalitarianism may prove to be the murder weapon of American capitalism. In the name of equality for all the world's peoples, the Immigration Act of 1965 threw open the nation's doors, converting America into what Theodore Roosevelt called, quote, a polyglot boarding house for the world, end quote. When one considers the scores of thousands of bureaucrats in federal, state, and local government, at colleges and in corporations, all working to ensure proportional representation of races, ethnic groups, and genders, we begin to see how equality and freedom are at war and why America is a failing nation. The pursuit of race, gender, ethnic, and economic equality is utopian. Imagine that a regime committed to absolute equality confiscated all the property and wealth of the nation and redistributed it in equal portions. How long would it be before the more able and aggressive citizens would repossess that wealth? Confiscation and redistribution would have to begin anew. Quote, an egalitarian society, wrote Murray Rothbard, can only hope to achieve its goals by totalitarian methods of coercion. And even here, we all believe and hope the human spirit of individual man will rise up and thwart any such attempts to achieve an ant-heap world. Unquote. No two men were more unlike than Rothbard and George Kennan. Here they agreed. Quote, I am anything but an egalitarian, Kennan wrote Eric Sevareid. I am very much opposed to egalitarian tendencies of all sorts. End quote. Biographer Leo Congdon says that Kennan, quote, viewed the passion for equality as the product of envy and resentment, end quote. Yet even professed conservatives have succumbed to the siren's call of egalitarianism. When Californians voted in Proposition 8 to restrict marriage to a man and a woman, former Solicitor General Ted Olson said the voters had violated the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. Quote, the Constitution of Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and Abraham Lincoln does not permit denying homosexuals the right to marry. End quote. Is Olson aware that the Constitution of Jefferson, Madison, and Lincoln did not contain the words equal or equality, or have an equal protection clause? All three presidents were dead before the 14th Amendment was added. Is Olson aware that Jefferson equated homosexuality with rape and believed homosexuals should be castrated and lesbians punished by, quote, cutting through the cartilage of her nose a hole of 1/2 inch diameter at the least, end quote. Now, this is no endorsement of Jefferson's proposal, But it is further proof that the egalitarian extremism of the late 20th and early 21st centuries is rooted not in the history of this republic, but in the ideology of modern man. Equality as political weapon. In revolutions where equality is the enthroned idol, in the French, Russian, Chinese, and Cuban revolutions, the dispossession of the old regime was often a merciless affair. Political and propertied classes, priests and poets were sent to the guillotine, the Lubyanka, the gallows, the firing squad, or the labor camp. And as the old order went off to jails, exile, and graves, the revolutionary elite, uglier and more brutal than those they displaced, moved into the palaces, mansions, and dachas. George Orwell's Animal Farm got it right. The revolution rises on the slogan, "All animals are equal," but once power is attained, the pigs move up into the farmhouse, and the slogan is amended to read, quote, "All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others," end quote. The revolution to establish equality for all invariably ends up establishing the dictatorship of the few. Quote, "Every revolution must have its myth," writes Duncan Williams, British professor of literature. And the most persistent of these, and one which, contrary to all human experience, has gained the most romantic adherence over the past century and a half, is the belief in the equality of man. End quote. From her life's work as an anthropologist, Margaret Mead concluded that this belief in equality is rooted in myths and dreams. Quote, "The assumption that men were created equal, with an equal ability to make an effort and win an earthly reward, although denied every day by experience, is maintained every day by our folklore and our daydreams." End quote. In the realm of sport, this belief seems curiously absent, writes Williams. Quote, "No man in his senses would dare to presume that he has, on the grounds of equality, an inalienable right to represent his country in the Olympic Games, any more than a boy would imagine he can automatically claim a place in his high school football team." End quote. Sports are too important to Americans to indulge such myths as the equality of all men. Over the past half-century, we have plunged trillions of dollars into public education, a large share of which has gone toward efforts to close racial gaps. But we have never come close to achieving equality in test scores. We have created a mammoth welfare state, but the percentage below the poverty line stopped dropping 4 decades ago. We have exempted half the nation from income taxes and laid 3/4 of the burden on the talented 10th. But we have never created equality of wealth and never will, as long as we are a free people. Indeed, the more we become an economy based on knowledge, not manual labor, the wider the inequalities become. To create the egalitarian society that exists only in the mind of ideologues, we are killing the wonderful country we inherited from the greatest generation. For decades, we have maintained standing armies of bureaucrats whose pay and benefits far exceed those of the taxpayers who subsidize and sustain them. Eventually one realizes that this transfer of wealth and power from one class to another is really what the equality game is all about. Quote, "The doctrine of equality is unimportant, because no one save perhaps Pol Pot and Ben Wattenberg really believes in it, and no one, least of all those who profess it most loudly, is seriously motivated by it. The real meaning of the doctrine of equality is that it serves as a political weapon." End quote. So wrote author and essayist Sam Francis. A century and a half earlier, Tocqueville had seen through egalitarianism to the drive for power that lay behind it. The sole condition which is required in order to succeed in centralizing the supreme power in a democratic community, is to love equality, or to get men to believe you love it. Thus the science of despotism, which was once so complex, is simplified and reduced to a single principle." End quote. Bertrand de Juvenal, who lived through the Nazi occupation, echoed de Tocqueville. Quote, "It is in the pursuit of utopia that the aggrandizers of state power find their most effective ally. Only an immensely powerful apparatus can do all that the preachers of panacea government promise." End quote. Long before him, the Italian philosopher Vilfredo Pareto wrote that, quote, "Equality is related to the direct interests of individuals who are bent on escaping certain inequalities not in their favor and setting up new inequalities that will be in their favor, this latter being their chief concern." Cui bono, who benefits, is ever the relevant question when a new class advances preaching the gospel of equality. Who gets the power? The diversity cult. Never in recorded history has diversity been anything but a problem. Ann Coulter, 2009. Diversity's beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Peter Scarry, Beyond Sociology, Does Diversity Work? I firmly believe the strength of our Army comes from our diversity. General George W. Casey, Army Chief of Staff. The Founders' Fears. "In our diversity is our strength" is now an article of faith of our ruling class. To ridicule the notion as risible, unrooted in history, and an affront to common sense is to identify oneself as a reactionary or racist. When did diversity and multiculturalism become national treasures? For this was surely not so in colonial times. The first decision of the Jamestown settlers was to build a fort to protect themselves from the Indians they held responsible for exterminating the colony known as Roanoke. An Indian raid in 1622, resulting in the massacre of a third of all the Jamestown colonists, appeared to vindicate their judgment that, quote, "red men," unquote, were mortal enemies who must be driven out of the lands they claimed in the name of England. The colonists were WASP supremacists. Without moral qualms, they drove the Indians over the mountains and established a society of white and Christian men and women, along with African slaves. Catholics were unwelcome. Priests were put back on the boats that brought them. Virginia had been named for the Virgin Queen, Elizabeth, who was determined to complete the work of her father, Henry VIII, who sought to end religious diversity in England by eradicating Catholicism. America was largely settled by colonists from the British Isles. Nearly 2 centuries after Jamestown and Plymouth Rock, when Washington took his oath as president, the 13 states were 99% Protestant. In 1790, U.S. citizenship was opened up for, quote, "free white persons of moral character. No others need apply." To the English, Scots-Irish, Welsh, and Dutch, however, there had been added Germans, whose presence in Pennsylvania alarmed that icon of the Enlightenment, Benjamin Franklin. Quote, "Those who come hither," said Franklin, "are generally of the most ignorant, stupid sort of their own nation, and as few of the English understand the German language, and so cannot address them either from the press or pulpit, 'tis almost impossible to remove any prejudices they once entertain. Not being used to liberty, they know not how to make a modest use of it. Why should Pennsylvania, founded by the English, become a colony of aliens who will shortly be so numerous as to Germanize us instead of our Anglifying them, and will never adopt our language or customs, any more than they can acquire our complexion." End quote. With the end of the French and Indian War, German immigration receded, easing the concerns of Dr. Franklin. Yet General Washington shared his fears. In peril at Valley Forge, he did not mean to entrust the cause to immigrants. Quote, "Let none but Americans stand guard tonight." End quote. In Federalist No. 2, John Jay looked out and saw a nation of common blood, faith, language, history, customs, culture, and principles. Quote, "Providence has been pleased to give this one connected country to one united people, a people descended from the same ancestors, speaking the same language, professing the same religion, attached to the same principles of government, very similar in their manners and customs, and who, by their joint counsels, arms, and efforts, fighting side by side throughout a long and bloody war, have nobly established general liberty and independence." End quote. Jay is describing the nation of Washington, Adams, Hamilton, and Jefferson, and he is saying it is our sameness that makes it possible for us to endure and succeed as a great nation. Jay goes on to issue this warning, quote, "This country and this people seem to have been made for each other, and it appears as if it was the design of Providence that an inheritance so proper and convenient for a band of brethren, united to each other by the strongest ties, should never be split into a number of unsocial, jealous, and alien sovereignties." Here Jay expresses the fear that this country, so fitting for a band of brothers united to each other by the strongest ties, could be lost. Should the nation, quote, "split into a number of unsocial, jealous, and alien sovereignties." End quote. Today, we embrace what our fathers feared. Celebrants of diversity point to the Irish immigration of the 1840s and the great wave of immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe from 1890 to 1920. America, they argue, was truly a melting pot, despite nativist fears, which successfully integrated these diverse peoples into one nation. They ignore the crucial elements that made America work. All these people were Europeans. All were white. Almost all were Christian. After each wave of immigration, there were long periods of little or no immigration that gave America time to assimilate the newcomers. And before they were fully assimilated, their children and grandchildren passed through deeply patriotic public and parochial schools where they were immersed in the language, literature, history, and traditions of this unique people. Today, however, those schools have been converted into madrasas of modernity, where it is forbidden to invoke the faith of our fathers, and American history is often taught as a series of crimes against peoples of color. Until 1965, U.S. immigration laws were written with one goal: to preserve the European character of the country. During the debate on the immigration law of 1965, Edward Kennedy, chairman of the subcommittee conducting the hearings, was passionate in his reassurances that the new law would not break with tradition or alter the nation's ethnic character. Quote, "Our cities will not be flooded with 1 million immigrants annually. Under the proposed bill, the present level of immigration remains substantially the same. Secondly, the ethnic mix of this country will not be upset. Contrary to the charges in some quarters, Senate Bill 500 will not inundate America with immigrants from any other country or area or the most populated and deprived nations of Africa and Asia." End quote. Only haters would tell such lies, Kennedy stormed. Quote, "The charges I have mentioned are highly emotional, irrational, and with little foundation in fact. They are out of line with the obligations of responsible citizenship. They breed hate of our heritage." End quote. Kennedy was assuring a nation that in a 1965 Harris poll said that by 2-1, it did not want any increase at all in immigration. What has happened since 1965, the diminution and displacement of the European majority, was done against the will of the majority of Americans. For decades, Americans have told pollsters they want immigration restricted and illegal aliens sent home. But what Americans want no longer seems to matter. Dumbing down the Navy. Quote, Naval Academy professor challenges rising diversity, end quote, ran the headline. The positive character of the opening paragraphs caused one to wonder, had some faculty sorehead protested because more minority youngsters were coming to Annapolis? Here are the opening paragraphs of the story in the Washington Post. Quote, of the 1,230 plebes who took the oath of office at the Naval Academy in Annapolis this week, 435 were members of minority groups. It is the most racially diverse class in the nation's 164-year history. Academy leaders say it's a top priority to build a student body that reflects the racial makeup of the Navy and the nation, end quote. Eventually, the Washington Post got around to the charge by Bruce Fleming, an English professor at Annapolis for 22 years, that a double standard had been used to create a class that was 35% minority. According to Fleming, who once sat on the Board of Admissions, white applicants to the Academy had to have all A's and B's and scores of 600 or higher on both the English and math parts of their scholastic aptitude test to qualify for a slate of 10 applicants from which one is drawn. But if you checked a box indicating that you are an African American, Hispanic, Native American, or Asian, quote, sat scores to the mid-500s, with quite a few C's in classes, typically produces a vote of qualified with direct admission to Annapolis. They're in, and given a pro forma nomination to make it legit. Minority applicants with scores and grades down to the 300s and C's and D's also come, though after a remedial year at our taxpayer-supported remedial school, the Naval Academy Preparatory School, end quote. Now, if this is true, the Naval Academy is running a two-tiered admission system of the kind that kept Jennifer Gratz out of the University of Michigan and was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. If true, the Academy is racially discriminating against hundreds of white students every year who studied their whole lives for the honor of an appointment to the U.S. Naval Academy. If true, what Annapolis is doing is worse because it was premeditated and programmed than what the New Haven city government did in denying Frank Ritchie and other white firefighters the promotions they earned in competitive exams. At least New Haven could say it acted out of fear of being sued. Yet the Chief of Naval Operations and Academy Superintendent appear proud of what they are doing. Fleming quotes CNO Admiral Gary Roughead as saying, quote, diversity is the #1 priority at the Naval Academy. Roughead's predecessor, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Admiral Mike Mullins, has described diversity as, quote, a strategic imperative. The Academy website calls diversity, quote, our highest personnel priority. Superintendent Vice Admiral Jerry Fowler has been quoted as saying he wants graduating classes that looked like the fleet, where 42% of enlisted personnel are non-white. A recent incident involving the elite color guard at Annapolis testifies to the absurd lengths to which our politically correct Naval Academy will go to remain in sync with the temper of the times. Here is the story. Quote, leaders of the U.S. Naval Academy tinkered with the composition of the color guard that appeared at a World Series game last month, November 2009, so the group would not be exclusively white and male. The net result was that one of the 6 who marched on Yankee Stadium's field, Midshipman Second Class Hannah Allaire was selected because her presence would make the Service Academy look more diverse before a national audience. What would Admirals Nimitz, Spruance, and Bull Halsey think of this? Academy graduates and retired officers were outraged at the removal of a midshipman from color guard honors because of his race and gender. Yet in the magazine Military Officer, Roughhead described today's Navy officer corps, NCOs, and civilian leadership as too male and too white. Quote, "If you look at the Navy today, it looks like America. But if we look at just the officers, I see a bunch of white guys. The same is true for our senior enlisted and senior civilians. The nation will be more diverse in 2040, and I believe the Navy must look like its nation." End quote. Is it also the Admiral's goal to have the Navy consist of 50% women and 27% folks over 60, with a significant fraction of gays and lesbians, because that is what the Admiral will have to shoot for if he wants the Navy to, quote, "look like its nation," end quote? Or do we want the finest Navy we can put to sea without regard to race, color, creed, or political correctness? How do Roughhead's diversity midshipmen do at Annapolis? They are overrepresented, says Fleming, in pre-college lower track courses, mandatory tutoring programs, and less challenging majors. Many struggle to master basic concepts. End quote. Though unqualified for college work, they will soon be operating the most complex weapon systems in the history of naval warfare: carriers, Aegis cruisers, and nuclear submarines. What would Admiral Hyman, why not the best, Rickover, the tough-minded genius who built our nuclear navy, think of Admiral Roughhead's affirmative action fleet? Quote, "We're dumbing down the Naval Academy," says Fleming, "and we're dumbing down the officer corps." Supporting his contention, 22% of incoming plebes in 2009 had SAT scores in math below 600, as compared to 12% in 2008. This is also an issue of justice. If hundreds of Hispanic and black youth were rejected by the Naval Academy year in and year out, though they had superior grades and SAT scores, Roughhead and Fowler would be explaining to a congressional committee why they ought not to be relieved of their posts for blatant race discrimination. In July 2010, the Washington Times unearthed an email from a, quote, "diversity accountability admiral" to flag officers, directing them to prepare a list to, quote, "identify our key performers by name." As CNO Roughhead is interested in who are the diverse officers with high potential and what is the plan for their career progression. He may ask what is being done within to ensure they are considered for key follow-on billets within the Navy. End quote. The message added, "The list must be held very closely." End quote. Of course it must, for it amounts, as the Washington Times wrote, to, quote, "blatant, invidious discrimination. If you are a white male, it might be time to set sail and seek opportunities elsewhere." End quote. Were this being done to promote white officers over black officers, those responsible would be instantly cashiered. The secrecy with which the Navy is doing this testifies to the shamefulness of it all. Yet the Navy only seems to be following Ivy League tradition. Depleted social capital. Quote, "Americans of all ages, all conditions, and all dispositions constantly form associations," Tocqueville marveled. Quote, "They have not only commercial and manufacturing associations, but associations of 1,000 other kinds. Whenever at the head of some new undertaking you see the government in France, or a man of rank in England, In the United States, you will be sure to find an association." End quote. What explains this American trait, to associate and cooperate for a common goal? Tocqueville thought it was because we had no aristocracy, no hereditary community of privileged and powerful men who were expected to unite people dependent upon them. An aristocracy was lacking in America, said Tocqueville, due to, quote, "equality of conditions," end quote. Quote, "Amongst democratic nations, all the citizens are independent and feeble. They can hardly do anything by themselves, and none of them can oblige his fellow men to lend him their assistance. They are therefore become powerless if they do not learn to voluntarily help each other." End quote. This tendency to come together for common goals is an essential element of what Robert Putnam, author of Bowling Alone, calls, quote, "social capital." According to the Heritage Foundation's Jason Richwine, who took Putnam's classes at Harvard, Putnam defined social capital as, quote, "social networks and the associated norms of reciprocity and trustworthiness," end quote. Quote, "Social capital turns out to be an exceptionally valuable commodity," writes Richwine. "Building complex networks of friends and associates, trusting others to keep their word, and maintaining social norms and expectations all grease the wheels of business by enabling cooperation," end quote. When social capital in a community is high, adds Richwine, people tend to have more friends, care more about their community, and participate in civic causes. Where social capital is greater, Putnam says, quote, "children grow up healthier, safer, and better educated. People live longer, happier lives, and democracy and the economy work better," end quote. When social capital evaporates, we enter Hobbes's world, where it is every man for himself and let the devil take the hindmost. In Bowling Alone, Putnam perceived a lowering of the reservoir of social capital since the 1950s, a growing separation of Americans from one another, a withdrawal into the self, alienation, and rising levels of distrust. Social capital was drying up, Putnam concluded, and undertook a massive study to learn why. E Pluribus Unum, Diversity and Community in the 21st Century, is the title of Putnam's 5-year study. His conclusions make hash of the cliché, "Our diversity is our strength." After 30,000 interviews, Putnam concluded that ethnic and racial diversity devastates communities. In diverse communities, people not only do not trust strangers, they do not trust their own kind. They withdraw into themselves. They support community activity less. They vote less. Quote, "People living in ethnically diverse settings," said Putnam, "appear to hunker down, that is, to pull in like a turtle," end quote. In October 2006, the Financial Times reported on Putnam's findings of the social devastation that diversity has wrought. Quote, "A bleak picture of the corrosive effects of ethnic diversity has been revealed in research by Harvard University's Robert Putnam, one of the world's most influential political scientists. His research shows that the more diverse a community is, the less likely its inhabitants are to trust anyone, from their next-door neighbor to the mayor," end quote. Professor Putnam, said the Financial Times, quote, "found trust was lowest in Los Angeles, the most diverse human habitation in human history," end quote. In diverse cities and towns, people tend to, quote, "withdraw, even from close friends, to expect the worst from their community and its leaders, to volunteer less, give less to charity, and work on community projects less often, to register to vote less, to agitate for social reform more, but have less faith they can actually make a difference, and to huddle unhappily in front of the television." End quote. Putnam adds a crushing footnote, writes columnist John Leo. His findings may underestimate the real effects of diversity on social withdrawal. Confirming Putnam in 2011, Travel and Leisure revealed in its annual Readers' Survey that New York had been replaced as, quote, the rudest city in America by what was once the sunny, laid-back capital of Southern California, Los Angeles. And though L.A. is the second-largest city in America, every NFL team that has ever moved there has eventually moved out for lack of public support. The L.A. Rams moved to Anaheim and then St. Louis. The L.A. Chargers moved to San Diego. The Los Angeles Raiders came from Oakland and then moved back. Diversity's deadly side. Nidal Malik Hassan was two men. One was the proud army major who wore battle fatigues to mosque, the other the proud Arab American who wore Muslim garb in civilian life. What brought Hassan's two identities into conflict was his conviction that Iraq and Afghanistan were immoral wars, and his shock that he was to be deployed to serve in the Afghan war against fellow Muslims, a sin against Allah. Hassan was torn. Which was his higher loyalty? Which, in Michael Vlahos's phrase, was his, quote, fighting identity, end quote. Hassan told friends he was a Muslim first and an American second. On November 5, 2009, when he told his neighbor, "I am going to do good work for God," and gave her his Koran, the call of jihad had prevailed over his oath of loyalty as an army officer. Reportedly shouting, "Allahu Akbar," as he fired, Hassan killed 13 and wounded 29 U.S. soldiers at Fort Hood, Texas. An internet posting over the name Nidal Hassan had equated suicide bombers with Medal of Honor winners who fall on grenades to save fellow soldiers. Although this was an act of wartime treason and terrorism, Hassan saw himself as a hero martyr who had put God and faith above his allegiance to a nation waging immoral war against Muslim peoples. Such conflicts of loyalty are not uncommon in war. President Woodrow Wilson feared that if he took America into the European war on the side of Britain, Irish Americans would rise in protest and German Americans march on Washington. FDR was so fearful that the blood ties of resident Japanese would trump any loyalty to the United States, he ordered 110,000 transferred out of California to detention camps. Among American Muslims, Hassan is atypical, but not alone. Other Muslims have been apprehended plotting terror attacks. In Arkansas in 2008, a Muslim shot 2 soldiers at a recruitment center. In Kuwait, before the invasion of Iraq, a Muslim sergeant threw a grenade and fired into the tent of his commanding officer, killing 2 and wounding 14. Why didn't the army discharge Hassan, whose extreme views were known? Quote, "Army specialists were warned about the radicalization of Major Nidal Malik Hassan years before the massacre," says the Boston Globe, "but did not act because they valued the rare diversity of having a Muslim psychiatrist," military investigators wrote in previously undisclosed reports. The reports concluded that, quote, "Because the Army had attracted only one other Muslim psychiatrist in addition to Hassan since 2001, it is possible some were afraid of losing diversity and thus were willing to overlook Hassan's deficiencies as an officer. Our diversity cult may have been responsible for the worst massacre on a U.S. military base in memory." Quote, "It may be hard to comprehend the twisted logic that led to this tragedy," said President Obama. But why? To John Derbyshire, the rationale was clear, quote, I do not find Hassan's logic twisted or hard to comprehend. His loyalty was to Islam. He believed America to be making war on Islam. Therefore, his loyalty commanded him to kill Americans. Seems perfectly logical to me, a darn sight more logical than the army continuing to promote him after they knew what was in his head." End quote. Major Hassan's massacre should rivet our attention on the issue of dual loyalties in the hearts of men in a country wedded to the idea that the greater our religious, racial, and ethnic diversity, the more moral a people we become. What Hassan saw as a higher loyalty to Islam moved him to murder fellow soldiers. What Alger Hiss saw as a higher loyalty to his political faith, communism, moved him to transfer American secrets to Soviet agents in Stalin's time. What Jonathan Pollard saw as his sacred identity as a Jew moved him to betray his oath, loot America's vital secrets, and transfer them to an Israeli agent. Homegrown Americans have been responsible for the massacres of fellow Americans from Oklahoma City to Columbine to Tucson, where 6 were killed and 13 wounded, including Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords. But unassimilated immigrants have also been responsible for mass murder. The 1993 Long Island Railroad Massacre, where 6 died and 19 were wounded, was the work of Jamaican Colin Ferguson, who hated whites. The Virginia Tech slaughter, where 32 died and 25 were wounded, was carried out by a Korean student. The massacre at the Binghamton Immigration Center in 2009, where 13 people were shot to death, was the work of Jiverly Wong, a Chinese man from Vietnam. Asked by a fellow worker if he liked the New York Yankees, Wong replied, quote, "No, I don't like that team. I don't like America. America sucks." End quote. No longer are we one nation and one people. Tens of millions have arrived and more are coming, whose loyalty remains to the countries they left behind and the faiths they carry in their hearts. And if in our, quote, long war against Islamo-fascism, we are perceived as trampling upon their true nations, faith, or kinfolk, they will see us, as Hassan came to see us, as the enemy of their sacred identity, the enemy of what they hold most dear. Years ago, the concept of America as melting pot was rejected by an establishment that now rhapsodizes about the most multiracial, multi-ethnic, multicultural country on earth. Yet such societies contain within the seeds of their own destruction, the ever-present peril of disintegration. Writes Michael Vlahos, quote, "Multi-ethnic and multi-religious societies have big identity problems. The bigger and the more complex they are, the more these cultures are vulnerable to the tug and pull of identities between culture and subculture. This can be a creative and enriching tension, yet so often it also creates contradictions within and competition over who owns the sacred identity, big identity." Major Hassan faced just such contradictions and competition. Forced to choose, he chose his sacred identity. Today, those same contradictions, that same competition of identities grows stronger as the nation grows ever more diverse, racially, ethnically, religiously, culturally, ideologically, and politically. Why, then, are we surprised by ethnic espionage, the cursing of our country in U.S. mosques, news that Somali immigrants are going home to fight our Somali allies, Pakistani-American boys departing to train in al-Qaeda camps, and illegal immigrants marching under Mexican flags? Eisenhower's America was a nation of 160 million, with a European Christian core and a culture all its own. We were a people then, and when, in 2050, We have become a stew of 435 million of every creed, culture, and color from every country on earth. What will hold us together? Pressed by ABC's George Stephanopoulos as to the motivation of Major Hassan in killing and wounding 42 fellow soldiers, Army Chief of Staff General Bernard Casey declined to speculate, but volunteered his deeper concern, quote, "This terrible event would be an even greater tragedy if our diversity becomes a casualty." The triumph of tribalism. Wars between nations have given way to wars within nations. Barack Obama, 2009, the Nobel Prize Address. Ethnic rivalry is as old as sin and as inextinguishable. Sir Christopher Meyer, 2008, British diplomat. Ethnic and racial conflict, it seems evident, will now replace the conflict of ideologies as the explosive issue of our times. Arthur Schlesinger, 1991. Nationalism is not resurgent. It never died. Neither did racism. They are the most powerful movements in the world today. Isaiah Berlin, 1991. A 2008 cover article in Foreign Affairs by Jerry Z. Muller, titled Us and Them, The Enduring Power of Ethnic Nationalism, argues that the relentless tug of tribal ties of blood and kinship will imperil the unity and survival of all of the multi-ethnic nations in the 21st century. Quote, Americans generally belittle the role of ethnic nationalism in politics, but it corresponds to some enduring propensities of the human spirit. It is galvanized by modernization, and in one form or another it will drive global politics for generations to come. Once ethnic nationalism has captured the imagination of groups in a multi-ethnic society, ethnic disaggregation or partition is often the least bad answer." End quote. Muller maintains that the drive of ethnic groups to separate and create nation-states in which their own unique culture, language, and faith are predominant, and their own kind rule, is among the most powerful drives of man. Remorseless and often irresistible, ethno-nationalism caused the world wars and tore apart the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, he argues. And the wisest policy for the United States may be to get out of its way. The West, Muller contends, has misread and mistaught itself its own history. A familiar and influential narrative of 20th century European history argues that nationalism twice led to war, in 1914 and then again in 1939. Thereafter, the story goes, Europeans concluded that nationalism was a danger and abandoned it. In the post-war era, Western Europeans enmeshed themselves in a web of transnational institutions, culminating in the European Union. This is not how it happened, writes Muller. Quote, "The creation of ethno-national states across Europe, a consequence of 2 world wars and ethnic cleansing, was a precondition of stability, unity, and peace. With no ethnic rivals inside their national homes, European peoples had what they had fought for and were now prepared to live in peace with their neighbors. As a result of this massive process of ethnic unmixing, the ethno-nationalist ideal was largely realized. For the most part, each nation in Europe had its own state, and each state was made up almost exclusively of a single ethnic nationality. During the Cold War, the few exceptions to this rule included Czechoslovakia, the Soviet Union, and Yugoslavia. But these countries' subsequent fate only demonstrated the ongoing vitality of ethno-nationalism. Czechoslovakia, the Soviet Union, and Yugoslavia were dictatorships, held together by monolithic communist parties. Had they not been police states, all would have disintegrated long before they did. Muller holds that what happened in Europe in the 20th century, the breakup of empires and nations into their ethnic components, is happening in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. The will to secede and establish one's own national home, like the will of a son to leave his father's house and start his own family, is more powerful than any ideology, be it communism, socialism, fascism, or democracy. Quote, ethno-nationalism has played a more profound role in modern history than is commonly understood, and the processes that led to the dominance of the ethno-national state and the separation of ethnic groups in Europe are likely to reoccur elsewhere. In areas where that separation has not yet occurred, politics is apt to remain ugly. End quote. The ethnic violence rampant in Asia, the Middle East, and Africa is a reenactment of what Europe went through, a sorting out of tribes. Muller's contention that ethno-nationalism is embedded in human nature and ethnic homogeneity may be a precondition of liberal democracy and peace echoes Robert Putnam, and if these men are right, the more multi-ethnic and multiracial we make America, the closer we advance to the bellum omnium contra omnes, the war of all against all. In Pandemonium, published in 1983, Senator Moynihan noted the remarkable blindness of foreign policy scholars to the power of ethno-nationalism in our time. Quote, there are today just 8 states on earth which both existed in 1914 and have not had their form of government changed by violence since then. These are the United Kingdom, 4 present or former members of the Commonwealth, the United States, Sweden, and Switzerland. Of the remaining 170 or so contemporary states, some are too recently created to have known much recent turmoil, but for the greater number that have gone, by far the most frequent factor has been ethnic conflict. End quote. Yet it is possible, Moynihan marveled, to have studied international relations through the whole of the 20th century and hardly to have noticed this. Since Pandemonium appeared, the United Kingdom, the United States, Sweden, and Switzerland have been torn by racial or religious divisions, and a look back to the last century confirms Muller's thesis. Ein Volk. That Hitler was the personification of the German race was dogma in his party, and it was the treaties of Versailles and Saint-Germain that forced millions of Germans under alien rule that provided Hitler with the program he rode to power. To understand the rage in the German soul that Hitler stoked, one must understand the history of the Great War from the German point of view. By spring 1918, Germany was victorious on 3 fronts. Romania had been routed in 1916. The royal family had fled. The Italians had been broken at Caporetto in 1917. The Russians had thrown down their rifles, the Tsar had abdicated, and the Bolsheviks had signed away Russia's European empire at Brest-Litovsk by February 1918. By spring, Ludendorff was back on the Marne. Had it not been for the Americans pouring into Allied lines at the rate of 250,000 soldiers a month, Germany might have won an armistice that would have left her undefeated on the Western Front and triumphant in the East. The dramatic reversal of 1918, the shock of defeat for the Germans, was tremendous. Then, after they had accepted an armistice on Wilson's 14 points, laid down their arms, and delivered the High Seas Fleet to Scapa Flow, the Allies proceeded to divide and dismember Germany. By declaring the Kaiser a war criminal, tearing off German provinces, disarming them and leaving them naked to their enemies, making them wage slaves of the victorious powers, forcing Germany to accept sole moral responsibility for causing the war and the damage done, then starving them until their leaders signed the treaty, the Allies stoked the ethno-nationalism of Germans more than Bismarck had with his victory over Napoleon III. As all Germans from Prussia to Bavaria had fought and bled together, and suffered together on the home front, so all believed that they had been lied to and betrayed by Wilson and the Allies, and that the lands and people taken from them must be restored. In his pledge to bring all lost Germans home to the Reich, Hitler had the support of Germans everywhere. Nationalism is an infantile disease, said Einstein. It is the measles of mankind. But in Germany in 1933, it was a rather more serious malady, from which Dr. Einstein would flee to America. In 1935, the Tsar, severed at Paris but promised a plebiscite to decide whether to remain outside Germany, voted by 90% to return. Catholic and socialist, Saarlanders preferred a Nazi regime that crushed unions and persecuted the Church to life apart from their kinsmen. Such is the power of ethno-nationalism. When in March 1936, German troops marched into the demilitarized Rhineland for the first time since 1918, there was wild rejoicing. Anschluss, the invasion and incorporation of Austria into the Reich, undertaken by Hitler to prevent a plebiscite on the permanent separation of his birth country, was celebrated in both nations. Many Austrians, who shared a culture with Germany, willingly exchanged nationhood and independence for a new life inside the new Reich. The Czech crisis of 1938 that led to Munich, and the Danzig crisis of 1939 that provoked Hitler's attack on Poland, came out of ethno-national demands. Hitler, an Austrian who grew up in Linz near the Czech border, when Czechs were ruled from Vienna, was determined to bring the Germans of Bohemia and Moravia out from under Prague and back under German rule, where the Sudetenlanders wished to be. At Munich, the British and French acceded to Hitler's demand. Poles and Hungarians then seized the Czech lands where their kinfolk lived. Slovaks, too, struggled to break free of Czech rule and create a nation. Ethno-nationalism tore Czechoslovakia apart. This caused a panicked British government to extend a war guarantee to Poland, then involved in a dispute with Berlin over return of 350,000 Danzigers to a fatherland from which they too had been severed against their will at Paris. Poland's refusal to discuss Danzig provoked Hitler into invading the country on September 1, 1939. Both world wars came out of ethno-national quarrels the great powers created or ignored. World War II is depicted as the good war, in which democracy triumphed over fascism. But the crises that caused the war were rooted in ethnic conflict, not ideology. German, Slovakian, Polish, Hungarian, and Ruthenian ethno-nationalism tore Czechoslovakia to pieces in 1938 and 1939. German ethno-nationalism in Danzig, that Poland refused to address, caused Hitler to destroy Poland, not the Polish form of government, to which Hitler had no objection. World on fire. Our situation may be about to become even more grim. How much more is told in World on Fire, how exporting free market democracy breeds ethnic hatred and global instability. Amy Chua's book is about those, quote, ethnic minorities who tend under market conditions to dominate economically, often to a startling extent, the indigenous majorities around them. Examples are the overseas Chinese, the Indians of East Africa, whites in South Africa, and Europeans in the Andean countries. Chua, whose aunt was a Chinese national whose throat was cut by a Filipino chauffeur resentful of her wealth, argues that while free markets often concentrate a nation's wealth among ethnic minorities, democracy gives power to impoverished ethnic majorities. This has proven a combustible and lethal cocktail. Quote, in these circumstances, the pursuit of free market democracy becomes an engine of potentially catastrophic ethno-nationalism. pitting a frustrated indigenous majority, easily aroused by opportunistic vote-seeking politicians, against a resented, wealthy, ethnic minority. This confrontation is playing out in country after country, from Indonesia to Sierra Leone, from Zimbabwe to Venezuela, from Russia to the Middle East." End quote. In 1965, the year of living dangerously, Sukarno was overthrown and Indonesian mobs massacred hundreds of thousands of Chinese, the market-dominant minority. Chua describes what happened in 1998, when Suharto, Sukarno's successor, who had protected the 3% of Chinese who controlled much of the nation's wealth, was in turn ousted. Quote, "Indonesians were euphoric. After the words free and fair elections hit the U.S. headlines, Americans were euphoric. Democratic elections, it was thought, would finally bring to Indonesia the kind of peace and legitimacy perfect for sustaining free markets. That's not what happened in Indonesia. The fall of Suharto's autocracy was accompanied by an eruption of ferocious anti-Chinese violence in which delirious, mass-supported Muslim mobs burned, looted, and killed anything Chinese, ultimately leaving 2,000 people dead. Across the Malacca Strait, a similar script was played out. Quote, "In May 1969, riots in Malaysia brought death to hundreds of Chinese, the rape of their women, suspension of parliament, and erection of a system of race preferences. As Malays, Bumaputra, sons of the soil, were 62% of the population, but had only 2% of the wealth, the government adopted sweeping ethnic quotas on corporate equity ownership, university admissions, government licensing, and commercial employment. It also initiated large-scale purchases of corporate assets on behalf of the Malay majority." End quote. Chinese companies were forced to set aside 30% of equity for Malays, but given no choice as to who their new partners would be. Firms seeking to list on the stock exchange were required to have 30% Bumaputra ownership. Not until 2009 did Malaysia's ruling coalition, facing recession, rising Chinese and Indian protests, and competition for foreign investment, relent and roll back the 30% rule. "Third world nationalizations in the post-colonial era," writes Chua, "by and large did not seek to abolish private property, but to transfer it from the market-dominant minority to the largest and most powerful tribe or ethnic group." Quote, "In Uganda, the politically dominant groups of the North have repeatedly subjected the economically powerful Baganda of the South to bloody purges. In Nigeria in 1966, tens of thousands of Igbo were slaughtered indiscriminately by furious mobs. In Ethiopia, the relatively prosperous Eritreans were recently expelled en masse. In Rwanda, the genocidal massacre of the Tutsi minority is inextricably connected with their historic economic dominance." End quote. In 1972, Idi Amin gave the 75,000 Indians who ran small businesses 90 days to get out of Uganda. Their property was confiscated and turned over to Africans. At liberation in 1979, the whites of Zimbabwe controlled most of the wealth. In 3 decades they have been picked clean. In a 2010 essay on, quote, "The White Tribes," end quote, Joshua Hammer writes, quote, "But nowhere was white flight more dramatic than in Zimbabwe, where the white population dropped from a peak of around 296,000 in 1975, 5% of the population, to 120,000 in 1999, to just 30,000 today." End quote. Mugabe has now gone after the last 4,000 white-owned farms that account for almost all of Zimbabwe's exports, to hand them to loyalists. Zimbabwe is now a basket case, its starving people fleeing to a South Africa that has started down the same path. On April 3, 2010, Eugene Terre-Blanche, a white nationalist and last-ditch defender of apartheid, was hacked to death by 2 black employees on his farm. The murder came, wrote the Financial Times, as, quote, Julius Malema, the demagogic leader of the African National Congress's powerful youth wing, has been traveling the country calling for nationalizations of private business and singing the apartheid-era song containing the lyrics, Kill the Boer. Since the end of apartheid, agricultural unions claim 3,000 white farmers have been killed. Half the white population has left the country. Though a South African court declared Kill the Boer hate speech, Malema continued to sing it and traveled to Zimbabwe to hail Mugabe for his violent seizures of white-owned farms. The Financial Times urged President Jacob Zuma to steal the thunder of his ANC youth leader with a more rapid redistribution of white-owned land to black South Africans. Since the end of apartheid, 15 million acres of farmland have been transferred to black owners. South Africa's regime, writes Robert Guest of The Economist, wants, quote, about 25% of most industries to be in black hands by 2010. The new black capitalists are supposed to pay a market price for their acquisitions, but they don't have the money, so they don't. Instead, the focus is on redistribution, and not the conventional sort from rich to poor, but from white to black, which is not the same. South Africa has embarked on probably the most extreme affirmative action program anywhere. Private companies above a certain size are obliged to try to make their workforces demographically representative, 75% black, 50% female, etc., from factory floor to boardroom. End quote. Under the Employment Equity Act and Black Economic Empowerment Act, companies are required to discriminate in hiring against white males in favor of white women, persons of color, people with disabilities, and those from rural areas. The Government Employment Act establishes a quota of 80% of all new jobs for blacks. A racial ethnic spoil system may be the future in the Third World, leading, as in Africa, to dispossession and departure of whites and Indians whose ancestors were brought there by the British to help run the empire and were abandoned when the British departed. In Australia, an open borders policy that has brought millions in from Asia, writes ethnologist Frank Salter, has begun to threaten social cohesion and national unity. Quote, ethnic stratification is taking place. Anglo-Australians are presently being displaced disproportionately in the professions and in senior managerial positions by Asian immigrants and their children. The situation is dramatic at selective schools which are the high road to university and the professions. Ethnocentrism is not a white disorder, and evidence is emerging that immigrant communities harbor invidious attitudes toward Anglo-Australians, disparaging their culture and the legitimacy of their central place in national identity. End quote. Nor are Americans strangers to race violence over who has what. Korean grocers are a visible presence in black communities, and the Korean aptitude for entrepreneurship is legendary. A 2002 census report found 95,000 black-owned businesses in America to 57,000 Korean-owned businesses, though blacks outnumber Korean Americans 25-1. Thus, a Korean American is 15 times as likely to own a business with employees as an African American. Of all Asian ethnic groups, Koreans have the highest rate of business ownership, nor has this gone unnoticed. In his 1991 rap song, Ice Cube reminded Korean shopkeepers who was boss in the hood. Quote, so pay respect to the black fist, or we'll burn your store right down to a crisp, 'cause you can't turn the ghetto into Black Korea. End quote. The following April, in the worst race violence in 20th century America, mobs poured out of South Central to attack Koreatown. 3 years later, after protests at Jewish-owned Freddy's Fashion Mart in Harlem, featuring chants of "Burn down the Jews' store," a berserk African-American burst in and shot 4 employees, then set fire to the store, killing 7 in all. How deep does the resentment run? In 2006, Andrew Young, former UN ambassador and former Atlanta mayor, was asked if he thought it right that Walmart, whose spokesman he was killing mom-and-pop stores in the African-American community. An agitated Young fired back, quote, "Well, I think they should. They ran the mom-and-pop stores out of my neighborhood. But you see, these are the people who have been overcharging us, selling us stale bread and wilted vegetables, and they sold out and moved to Florida. I think they've ripped off our communities enough. First it was Jews, then it was Koreans, now it's Arabs. Very few black people own these stores." End quote. The Korean presence in the black community seems ever on the mind, especially the Korean monopoly of the black hair market. Quote, "Whether you're in the suburbs of Houston or on MLK Boulevard in any town USA," writes R. Asmaran in the Atlanta Post, "that image of the few Koreans in the neighborhood only existing behind the cash register of liquor, beauty supply, and other retail shops is still perplexing." Asmaran reported that in September 2010, there are over 9,000 Korean-owned beauty supply stores serving a billion-dollar market for black hair. End quote. The Korean, quote, "concentration in these businesses promoted a shroud of secrecy and protectiveness that fueled part of the tension between Korean business owners and the urban African-American community, which famously erupted during the 1992 Los Angeles riot." End quote. Asians and whites are America's market-dominant majority. In half a century, they will become the minority. Already they are shrinking minorities in major cities. By Chua's thesis, racial and ethnic majorities will use electoral power to elevate politicians to expropriate the wealth of the minority, as is happening with the ever heavier taxes on the upper middle class and wealthy Asian and white in California. The Obama Democrats, who campaigned for abolishing, quote, "tax cuts for the rich," individuals earning $200,000 a year, and families earning $250,000, may be a harbinger of what is to come with the rise of Third World America. Curse or blessing? Is ethno-nationalism a genetic disease of mankind that all good men should quarantine wherever it breaks out? Or is this drive of awakened peoples to create nations of their own, where their own kind come first, a force of nature that must be accommodated if we are ever to know peace? To many who lived through the 20th century, the poisonous fruit of ethno-nationalism, the horrors it produced from Nanking to Auschwitz to Rwanda, answer the question with finality. Ethno-nationalism is a beast that must be chained. Yet ethno-nationalism liberated the captive nations and brought down the evil empire. And with the rise of Solidarity and its crushing by General Jaruzelski on Moscow's orders, America's cry was, quote, "Let Poland be Poland." Ethno-nationalism gave birth to scores of African and Asian nations that came out of the old European empires. Many are prosperous and peaceful. America was herself a product of ethno-nationalism, the awakening consciousness of the colonists that while we were the children of Europeans, we were also a new people, unique, separate, and identifiable, Americans. Ethno-nationalism was behind the pogroms of Europe, but created the nation of Israel. Ethno-nationalism led to the exodus of 600,000 Arabs from their homes in Palestine, the Nakba, or catastrophe of 1948. But it also birthed in the refugee camps and 2 intifadas a new people. Palestinians will, God willing, soon have a nation of their own. If ethno-nationalism has been behind terrible crimes, have not great crimes been committed in the name of religion? Do we therefore decry all religions? Nations are the wealth of humanity, its generalized personalities. The very least of them wears its own special colors, and bears within itself a special facet of divine intention, said Solzhenitsyn. We may deny the existence of ethno-nationalism, detest it, condemn it, but this creator and destroyer of empires and nations is a force infinitely more powerful than globalism, for it engages the heart. Men will die for it. Religion, race, culture, and tribe are the four horsemen of the coming apocalypse. But let us give the last word to Professor Jerry Muller. Quote, Americans find ethno-nationalism discomforting both intellectually and morally. Social scientists go to great lengths to demonstrate that it is a product not of nature but of culture. But none of this will make ethno-nationalism go away. The White Party. The face of America is changing. It's not Joe the plumber. Soledad O'Brien, November 4, 2008, CNN anchor. The Republican Party is becoming the monochromatic party. Gloria Borger, November 4, 2008, CNN commentator. If you look at folks of color, they're more successful in the Democratic Party than they are in the in the Republican Party. Howard Dean, August 2008, Democratic Party chairman. A gaffe, said Michael Kinsley, is when a politician blurts an impermissible truth, then hastily recants, lest he cripple his career. In the quotation above, Howard Dean committed a gaffe. He told an inconvenient truth, for the Republican Party may be fairly described as the White Party, though this was not always true. Before the New Deal, the Democrats were the White Party, as they had almost zero black support, having been the party of secession and segregation, while Republicans were the party of Lincoln and emancipation. In the Depression year of 1932, a majority of black Americans voted for Hoover and against FDR. Franklin Roosevelt swiftly ended that tradition in the North, where his New Deal drew support from black voters, even as his Dixiecrat allies continued to deny African Americans the right to vote in the 11 states of the old Confederacy. How did presidential nominees like Al Smith and FDR of New York and Adlai Stevenson of Illinois sustain the alliance of Northern liberals and Southern segregationists? By balancing progressive candidates with Southern or border state segregationists on every national ticket between 1928 and 1960, except 1940. Those vice presidential nominees were Joe Robinson of Arkansas in 1928, John Nance Garner of Texas in 1932 and 1936, Harry Truman of Missouri, who had flirted with the Klan, in 1944, Alvin Barkley of Kentucky in 1948, John Sparkman of Alabama in 1952, who would sign the Southern Manifesto denouncing the Brown decision, and Estes Kefauver of Tennessee in 1956. Before offering the vice presidency to Henry Wallace in 1940 as a replacement for Cactus Jack Garner, FDR sounded out Senator James Burns of South Carolina. Jimmy Burns, a protege of Pitchfork Ben Tillman, was a white supremacist. This is a white man's country and will always remain a white man's country, he once declared. Burns, regarded as a Southern moderate, had led the Senate battle against the anti-lynching law and helped filibuster it to death in 1938. Offered the vice presidency in 1940, he turned it down, fearing his record on race would hurt FDR in the North. Had Burns accepted the vice presidency, he would almost surely have become president when FDR died in 1945. Giving America a white supremacist to lead her into the post-colonial era. On his succession to the presidency, Truman, who also admired Burns, named him Secretary of State. Democratic presidents also rewarded their segregationist allies with Supreme Court seats. Wilson named the anti-Semite James C. McReynolds to the court in 1914. The 1924 official photograph of the court was never taken, as McReynolds refused to sit beside Jewish Justice Louis Brandeis. FDR named former Klansman Hugo Black of Alabama to the court in 1937. As a lawyer, Black had won an acquittal for a Methodist pastor and Klansman who admitted to murdering the Catholic priest who presided at his daughter's wedding to a Puerto Rican. Black's law partner was a Cyclops of the Birmingham Clavern. His Senate campaign manager was the Grand Dragon of the Alabama Klan. After election to the Senate, Black, who had marched and spoken in robes, hood, and mask, accepted a lifetime membership in the Klan. As Black tells it, FDR was fully aware of his Klan associations. When McReynolds stepped down in 1941, FDR replaced him with Burns. Despite NAACP protests, Burns was confirmed by a Democratic Senate 8 minutes after his nomination was submitted. This is the buried past of the Democratic Party, of which Bruce Bartlett has written. For almost a century, since Roger Taney, there had been a tradition of one Catholic justice on the court. When Justice Frank Murphy died in 1949, Truman terminated that tradition. Eisenhower restored it with William Brennan. In the 2 presidential campaigns of Wilson and the 4 of FDR, Democrats swept every Confederate state all 6 times. The Democratic candidate in 1924, John W. Davis, carried every Confederate state, and with the exception of Oklahoma, only Confederate states. Truman took 7 Southern states to Strom Thurmond's 4. Dewey got none. In 1952 and 1956, most of the electoral votes Adlai Stevenson got came from the most segregated states of the South. Only when Nixon swept the South in his 49-state landslide of 1972 did a, quote, Southern strategy become the mark of the beast. Among the 24 senators to sign the 1956 Southern Manifesto, which urged resistance to the Brown decision, were such grandees as John Sparkman, Walter George, Richard Russell, John Stennis, Sam Ervin, Strom Thurmond, Harry Byrd, John McClellan, Russell Long, Jim Eastland, J. William Fulbright, and George Smathers, a carousing buddy of JFK. All were Democrats. House Democrats who signed the manifesto and would play major roles in national politics included Wilbur Mills, Carl Vinson, Hale Boggs, and Mendel Rivers. In all, 99 Democrats signed the Dixie Manifesto, but only 2 Republicans. With the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the nomination of conservative Barry Goldwater, Black allegiance to the party of Lincoln ended. Although a majority of votes against the bill were cast by Southern Democrats, Goldwater voted with them. He had been a member of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, had contributed to its campaign to desegregate Phoenix schools, and had desegregated his own department store and the Arizona Air National Guard when he was chief of staff. But Goldwater was a constitutionalist who believed desegregating public accommodations was a state, not a federal responsibility. Nevertheless, perceived as hostile to black aspirations, Goldwater lost the African-American vote to Lyndon Johnson by 16-1, and Republicans have never found the favor with African Americans that they had in national elections for the century after Lincoln. Half a century ago, however, the black vote was not as significant as today. Blacks could not vote in any numbers in the South. Democrats ruled Dixie as a fiefdom and used a variety of ruses to prevent African Americans from going to the polls. Northern blacks did not register a vote to the same extent as whites, and when they did, they gave the party of Lincoln 1 vote for every 2 they delivered to the party of FDR. Eisenhower got 39% of the black vote in 1956. Running against John F. Kennedy, Richard Nixon won 32%. Goldwater's share of the African-American vote was only 6%. With the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the mass registration of African Americans began, and with the Immigration Act of 1965, which led to tens of millions coming from the Third World, the ethnic and racial composition of the American electorate was changed forever. Indian Summer of the GOP. On November 2, 2010, the Republican Party swept to its greatest off-year triumph since before World War II, picking up 5 governorships, 6 Senate seats, 63 House seats, and 680 state legislators. As of January 2009, few predicted such a comeback, though some of us said that Obama, like Hoover, would be blamed for the tough times ahead, even though a major recession had been baked into the cake before he arrived. Many analysts were writing the GOP's obituary. James Carville's 2009 book was titled, quote, 40 More Years, How the Democrats Will Rule the Next Generation. The issues that caused a defection from the Democrats are not in dispute. They include the 9.5% unemployment for 14 months before the election, the failure of the $787 billion stimulus to stop the hemorrhaging of jobs, fear of deficits of 10% of GDP and a national debt surging to 100% of GDP, the public's rejection of Obamacare, the belief that the federal government is seizing too much power, the sinking popularity of the president, Nancy Pelosi, Harry Reid, and the rise of the Tea Party, not necessarily in that order. But the real story of the 2010 election is about who stayed home and who came out to vote. The Republican Party rolled to the most stunning off-year election victory in living memory because white America came out to vote and minorities and the young stayed home. According to a New York Times post-election analysis, the white vote rose from 75% of the electorate in the McCain-Obama race of 2008 to 78% in 2010, and the Republican share rose from 55% in 2008 to 62%. In the South, the Republican share of the white vote rose to 73%, inundating Blue Dog veterans like John Spratt of South Carolina and Gene Taylor of Mississippi. In the Deep South, where segregation endured the longest, segregation has returned, this time to politics. Quote, of the 9 Democratic representatives that remain from states of the Deep South, only one, John Barrow of Georgia, is white. Of the 28 Republicans, only one, the newly elected Tim Scott of South Carolina, is black. End quote. Says Dave Mudcat Saunders, a strategist to Southern Democrats, quote, right now in most of Dixie, it is culturally unacceptable to be a Democrat. It's a damn shame, but that's the way it is. End quote. In White Flight, his analysis of the 2010 congressional election, Ron Brownstein of National Journal put the Republican share of the white vote at 60% and the Democratic share at 37%. But he notes that the alienation of white America from Obama and his policies is even more pronounced. Quote, exactly 75% of minority voters said they approved of Obama's performance. Only 22% said they disapproved. Among white voters, just 35% approved of the president's performance, while 65% disapproved. A head-turning 49% of whites said they strongly disapproved. Those whites voted Republican last fall by a ratio of 18-1. Republicans again lost the youth vote, 18 to 29 years of age, by a margin of 56 to 42%. But this was a far better showing than John McCain's, who lost them by more than 2-1. Republicans won all other age groups, including seniors, by 20 points. However, Democrats carried 73% of non-whites, including Asians, Hispanics, and African Americans. Catholics and Protestants were 89% of the electorate, and the GOP won 55% of the Catholics and 61% of the Protestants. Once again, the Republican vote was over 90% Christian and over 90% white. The crisis of the GOP can be stated simply. Due to immigration and higher birth rates among people of color, America is becoming less white and less Christian, and therefore, inevitably, less Republican. The Democratic base is growing, and the Republican base is dying. If a historian were to write the decline and fall of the House of Reagan, he could find no better place to study than Orange County, birthplace of Richard Nixon, home of John Wayne, Goldwater country, and a bastion of the John Birch Society. In this Alcazar of the old right, Reagan thumped Carter 3-1. Yet Obama ran McCain close to a dead heat, for the Orange County of yesterday is gone. Republican registration has fallen to 43%. 45% of residents speak a language other than English in their homes. Writes Adam Nagorny of the New York Times, quote, "Whites make up only 45% of the population. This county is teeming with Hispanics as well as Vietnamese, Korean, and Chinese families. Its percentage of foreign-born residents jumped to 30% in 2009 from 6% in 1970, and visits to some of its corners can seem like a trip to a foreign land." End quote. In 2010, Loretta Sanchez, who captured the Orange County seat of Bob Dornan in 1996 in a photo finish, in which illegal aliens allegedly provided her margin of victory, raised the specter of Hispanics in peril of losing a seat to a rival ethnic group. Sanchez told Jorge Ramos of Univision's Al Punto program, quote, "The Vietnamese are trying to take away this seat from us and give it to this Van Tron, who's very anti-immigrant and very anti-Latino," end quote. The old ideological politics of Orange County has given way to a new tribal politics. The county was once a microcosm of and a metaphor for Middle America, but immigration has changed its character forever. The new Hispanic poor and working class depend on government and vote for government. Vietnamese, Koreans, and Chinese no longer see the Republican Party as their natural home, as the Cold War anti-communism of the GOP has become irrelevant in the new century. A loss of manufacturing and outsourcing of jobs have changed Orange County from a middle-class bastion into a place where the disparities of wealth have visibly widened. Quote, "The political texture of this county, which is larger in population than Nevada or Iowa," writes Nagorny, "is changing, and many officials say it is only a matter of time before many Republican office holders get swept out with the tide." End quote. As Orange County goes, so goes California, and as California goes, so goes America. Another cause of the approaching Republican crisis is the division of the nation into taxpayers and tax consumers. Since Reagan, tax cuts have dropped 1/3 of all wage earners off the tax rolls. When tax credits are factored in, 47% of U.S. workers pay no U.S. income tax. A study by the Congressional Joint Committee on Taxation found that in 2009, fully 51% of all households owed no federal income tax. If one pays no federal income tax, yet reaps a bonanza of federal benefits, it makes sense to vote for the party of government and against a party that would cut the government. 2 centuries ago, John C. Calhoun, who studied the failings and failures of democracies, precisely described our present condition. Quote, "The necessary result, then, of the unequal fiscal action of the government is to divide the community into 2 great classes, one consisting of those who in reality pay the taxes and bear exclusively the burden of supporting the government, and the other of those who are the recipients of their proceeds through disbursements, and who are in fact supported by the government, or in fewer words, to divide it into taxpayers and tax consumers." End quote. Calhoun's division of the nation describes the America of today. Were the taxing power to be exploited, he warned, quote, "for the purpose of aggrandizing and building up one portion of the community at the expense of the other, it must give rise to 2 parties and to violent conflicts and struggles between them to gain control of the government." End quote. Calhoun was forecasting the Tea Party revolution. We are today engaged in his, quote, "conflicts and struggles," quote, a synonym for class warfare. For the vast majority of the 4.4 million on welfare, the 22 million on government payrolls, the 23 million receiving earned income tax credit checks, the 44 million on food stamps, the 50 million on Medicaid, the 70 million wage earners who pay no income tax, the Democratic Party is their party. We are approaching the tipping point where there will be more tax consumers than there are taxpayers. Reports the Wall Street Journal, quote, "Nearly half of all Americans now live in a household in which someone receives government benefits more than at any time in history, while the fraction of American households not paying federal income taxes has grown to an estimated 45% in 2010 from 39% 5 years ago." End quote. 13% of U.S. households do not even pay Social Security taxes. Why should scores of millions of people who pay no taxes but partake of a cornucopia of benefits vote for a party committed to cutting benefits? H.L. Mencken's quip in the 1930s about the New Deal has become reality in the 21st century. America has indeed been divided, quote, "into those who work for a living and those who vote for a living." End quote. The Republican lock on the presidency, crafted by Nixon and patented by Reagan, has been picked. Will 2010 prove to be the Indian summer of the Republican Party before an endless winter sets in? Comeback Road. For conservatives, the book titled How Barack Obama Won reads like something out of Edgar Allan Poe's Tales of the Macabre. Yet on closer reading one can discern the Republican path to victory in 2012, even as the light shone upon that path in 2010. First, the bad news. Obama raised the black vote to 13% of the national vote, then carried it 95% to 4%. The Republican share of the Hispanic vote, 9% of the electorate in exit polls, 7.4% in census figures, fell from Bush's 40% in 2004 to 32% for McCain. Young voters aged 18 to 29 went for Obama by a margin of 66 to 31%. Obama ran stronger among white voters with a college education than Kerry or Gore. Put starkly, the voting groups that are expanding as a share of the electorate, Hispanics, Asians, African Americans, and whites with college degrees, were all trending ever more Democratic in 2008. The voters most loyal to the GOP, white folks without college degrees and religious conservatives, were shrinking as a share of the electorate. Where were the signs of hope? First, in 2008, 75% of voters thought the country was headed in the wrong direction. Obama won these voters 62 to 36%. But if the country is seen as headed in the wrong direction in 2012, as most Americans believe today, this will cast a cloud over Obama's candidacy. McCain's albatross in 2008 would become Obama's in 2012. Second, only 27% of voters in 2008 approved of Bush's performance by Election Day. Only Truman, as a sitting president in an election year, had a lower rating, 22% in 1952. That year, Democrats lost the White House and both houses of Congress. Chuck Todd's point is dramatic, quote, "With the single exception of Missouri, which barely went for McCain, Obama won every state where Bush's approval rating was below 35% in the exit polls, and he lost every state where Bush's approval rating was above 35%. End quote. Obama rode Bush's coattails to victory. Had Bush been at 35 or 40% on Election Day, McCain might have won. In 2012, Obama will not have George Bush to kick around anymore. Third, on Election Day 2008, 93% rated the economy as not so good or poor. The GOP will not have to wear those concrete boots in 2012. Obama will, as he wore them in the 2010 wipeout. Fourth, on candidates' qualities, the situation looks even rosier for Republicans. In 2008, no less than 34% of the electorate said the most important consideration in a candidate was that he, quote, be for change, end quote. Not only was Obama the change candidate, he patented the issue and carried this third of the nation looking for change by an astounding 89-9%. But in 2012, Obama will be the candidate of continuity, the incumbent. The candidate of change will be his Republican opponent. Fifth, the second most critical consideration of voters in choosing a president was values. 30% of the electorate put values first. And among that 30%, McCain won 65-32. Values issues are the GOP's ace in the hole. What that 2-to-1 McCain advantage argues is that the neoconservatives, instructing the GOP to dump values issues, should themselves be dumped. Traditional values are a powerful magnet for the most democratic of minorities. African Americans gave McCain 5% of their votes in California, but gave Proposition 8, the proposal to outlaw gay marriage, 70% of their votes. Quote, no ethnic group anywhere, said the Washington Post, rejected the sanctioning of same-sex unions as emphatically as the state's black voters, end quote. California Hispanics gave McCain 23% of their votes, but gave 53% of their votes to Proposition 8. Why would the GOP throw away these cards? McCain lost Colorado by 10 points, but the Colorado Civil Rights Initiative, which would have outlawed race and gender preferences, lost in a dead heat. In Michigan, California, Washington, and Nebraska, the ban on affirmative action has won a huge majority of whites and a larger share of black, Hispanic, and Asian voters than did John McCain. If the conservative side of these issues is more popular than the GOP, why would the GOP abandon them? The national question. On the national question, Americans are united. There still exists in their hearts the will to remain one nation under God and one people, united by history, heritage, and language, committed to the proposition that in America, men and women are to be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Americans still believe that we are all equal in rights, not because of where we came from, but because of who we are, Americans. In all 31 states where referenda have been held, traditional marriage has been affirmed, and same-sex marriage has been rejected. In every state but one, where Ward Connerly's Civil Rights Initiative that outlaws race, ethnic, and gender preferences has been put on the ballot, it has won. In every state where making English our official language has been put to the voters, they have said yes. In almost every state, county, and municipality, where restrictions on public benefits for illegal aliens have been put to the vote, they have been endorsed by wide majorities. The agenda of the left, dechristianizing America, multiculturalism, racial preferences, and unrestricted immigration, has been imposed from above and resisted by a people who do not understand the strength that is theirs if they will but unite and fight. The last chance. Are the good times really over for good? Merrill Haggard, 1981. During the Glenn Beck rally at Lincoln Memorial on the anniversary of Dr. King's speech, Sarah Palin emitted a cry from the heart. In retort to Obama's expressed desire to be a transformational president, Palin told the throng, quote, "We must not fundamentally transform America, as some would want. We must restore America." End quote. Can we restore America? Or has the America we grew up in already been transformed into another country? It is a contention of this book that America has been changed in our lifetimes, that a revolution has taken place. that though we appear to the world the same country, we are a different nation on a course far off the one our fathers set. Adams, Jefferson, Madison, and Hamilton disbelieved in one-man, one-vote democracy. We worship it. They believed in a creator. We have exiled him from our schools and replaced him with evolution. They believed all men had a God-given and inalienable right to life. With Roe v. Wade, we canceled that right for the unborn, 50 million of whom have since perished. For 250 years after the settlers came to Jamestown, our fathers sought to build a Protestant and British country. From the Irish immigration of the 1840s to the first Irish Catholic president in 1960, the United States sought to maintain its character and identity as a Christian and European nation. To assert that as an ideal today would constitute a hate crime. The Great Experiment. Our intellectual, cultural, and political elites are today engaged in one of the most audacious and ambitious experiments in history. They are trying to transform a Western Christian republic into an egalitarian democracy made up of all the tribes, races, creeds, and cultures of planet Earth. They have dethroned our God, purged our cradle faith from public life, and repudiated the Judeo-Christian moral code by which previous generations sought to live. They have declared men and women to be basically the same, that all voluntary sexual relations are morally equal, that the traditional family is but one social option, that men can marry men and women can marry women, that race is a social construct invented by bigots bent on repressing others, that all are endowed with the intelligence and ability to succeed in the most competitive society on earth. All religions and all lifestyles are equal, and all are to be equally respected. These elites will fight to ensure that a mosque is built at ground zero with the same ferocity as they will to ensure that no nativity scene ever appears on the National Mall. If there is an inequality of rewards in society, they believe, this is the residue of a reactionary America, the fruit of societal injustice, and it is the moral duty of our modern state to rectify that injustice and mandate equality. Those who reject these truths are benighted or bigoted. Our secular elites believe in this revolution. The people never did. Middle America detests it. Thus it has had to be imposed from above, by judges, bureaucrats, professors, and those who control the content of our culture. One part of America believes we are headed for a wonderful new age. The silent majority thinks the country has lost its mind. For as Professor Williams, author of Trousered Apes, wrote at the beginning of this great experiment, quote, various practical attempts in the Soviet Union and China, for example, have been made to establish equality as a basis for society. All such efforts either have failed or must fail because no stable society can be built upon a theory which runs counter to reality. The harsh but unavoidable fact is that men are unequal in terms of hereditary abilities. Some are born with a greater degree of intelligence, a greater capacity for sympathy, a greater ability to succeed than others. Quote, the persistence of this myth of equality, wrote Williams, and the frustrations which its advocates experience constitute a grave psychological and political problem. This is what they call an understatement. The experiment is failing and will continue to fail, for it is based on a theory which runs counter to reality, an ideology whose tenets are at war with the laws of nature. Like the Marxists who are going to create a new man and a new society, our establishment is attempting the impossible. Quote, to create a concept is to leave reality behind, end quote, wrote the Spanish philosopher Ortega y Gasset. Our elites have created a concept of the ideal nation, the most egalitarian, diverse, democratic, and liberated that ever existed. And they have mobilized the vast power of government and law to force America to conform to that concept. They will fail, and this great and good country will die of their experiment. Quote, some men see things as they are and say, why? I dream things that never were and say, why not? said Robert Kennedy in the campaign that cost him his life. But there's a reason why things are as they are, and why some dreams never come true. Unalterable human nature, the unconquerable and eternal enemy of all utopias. Quote, "We have it in our power to begin the world over again," end quote, wrote the idealist of 1776 Thomas Paine, who would barely escape the guillotine in the Revolution of 1789 that arose on the promise to begin the world over again. In 1991, author Claes Wren called this messianic compulsion to reshape America and the world, quote, "the new Jacobinism," as it recalled the intellectuals who worshipped Rousseau, made the French Revolution, and sought to force France and Europe at a legendary cost in blood to conform to their ideals. Republicans, as Lewis Carroll's White Queen said, also managed to, quote, "believe 6 impossible things before breakfast." They have declared that, quote, "deficits don't matter, that America grew into a mighty industrial power through free trade, that it is within our power to democratize mankind and, quote, end tyranny in our world," end quote. As the melting pot turned millions of children and grandchildren of European immigrants into Americans, Republicans assert, we can bring in countless millions more from every country and culture and create a stronger, better, happier, more united nation than the America of 1960. But where in history has such diversity led to anything but cacophony and chaos? Racially, culturally, ethnically, politically, America is disintegrating. For the 3rd consecutive year, the deficit is near a peacetime record of 10% of GDP. The trade deficit is returning to the heights of 2007-2008. U.S. dependence on foreign nations for the needs of our national life and the loans to pay for them has never been greater. We are mired in 2 wars with no end in sight. If America is not to end up with all the other great nations and empires on the ash heap of history, we need to shed our illusions and see the world as it is. Among the leaders of the 20th century, Deng Xiaoping is regarded as a wise man, for he saw that Marxism and Maoism were at war with human nature, that a great nation could not be built to endure on such principles, that China was in danger of going down, and he acted on those convictions. Without renouncing Marx or Mao, Deng put the world revolution on a shelf and embraced state capitalism. What difference does it make if the cat is black or white, Deng said, as long as it catches mice? Ideology was the poison, reason the antidote. So Deng did what Lenin did with his new economic policy. He adopted the enemy's ideas to save his regime. But astonishingly, even as the Marxists were abandoning communism as a failed experiment, the pragmatic Americans who won the Cold War were being converted to a utopian ideology. We are trying to create a nation that has never before existed, of all the races, tribes, cultures, and creeds of Earth, in which all are equal. In the pursuit of the perfect society of our dreams, we are killing the country we inherited, the best and greatest on earth. Economic patriotism. Who won the war? Ask the posting on freerepublic.com. Below the question were pictures of Hiroshima in 1945, all ashes and ruins, and of Detroit in 1945, mightiest industrial hub on earth. Then came photos of Hiroshima 65 years later, a gleaming city, and Detroit in 2010, a burned-out shell. Who won the war? We won the World War and the Cold War, but we lost the post-Cold War and we are losing the future. From 2000 to 2010, America saw 50,000 factories close and 6 million manufacturing jobs disappear. China, Japan, the EU, Canada, and even Mexico ran up hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars in trade surpluses with the United States. Is this because their workers are more capable and efficient? No. Worker for worker, Americans are the best. Why then are we losing? because China, Japan, and Germany are trade predators, not trade partners. They look on trade the way Vince Lombardi looked on football. Winning isn't everything. Winning is the only thing. Germany, Japan, and China recite the Catechism of Free Trade and practice economic nationalism. Their tax and trade policies, from currency manipulation to value-added taxes on imports and rebates for exports, to subsidies for national champions, to non-tariff barriers on U.S. goods, discriminate in favor of their products in their market and in our market. We talk about a level playing field, but they landscape the field to win. The success of economic nationalism may be seen in the shifting balance of power. China is the world's rising power, and America is everywhere seen as the declining power. Yet while the Chinese and German economies are but one-third the size of ours, both export more than we do. How? The game is rigged, and we need to walk away from the table, for if we do not cure ourselves of this obsession with free trade, the industrial evisceration of the United States will continue until we make nothing the world wants but Hollywood movies. Ralph Gomery, a former IBM Senior Vice President for Science and Technology, relates what the naivete of the free traders and the greed of our corporate elite are doing to our country. Quote, "We have too many people today who see in the destruction of our key industries by well-organized and highly subsidized actions from abroad nothing more than the effects of free trade and the operations of a perfectly free market. This is a delusion and a dangerous one. We also have an elite industrial leadership that too often sees itself with no other duty than maximizing the price of their company's stock, even if that means offshoring the capabilities and know-how for advanced production to other nations that have no free markets themselves." End quote. The heart of the problem, writes Gomery, is, quote, lack of leadership from our own government, which must realize that the fundamental goals of the country and of our companies have diverged. What's good for General Motors is not good for America if General Motors is shifting plants and production to Asia to build and export cars to America. America has been running the largest trade deficits in history for decades, but a U-turn could be effected by adopting tax and trade policies that set as national goals the reindustrialization of America, the recapture of that huge slice of the U.S. market lost to foreign producers, and the substitution of U.S.-made goods for foreign goods until America is a self-sufficient nation again, as she was from Lincoln's time to JFK's. To reduce our dependence on goods made abroad and grow our dependence on goods made in the United States, we should impose tariffs on all imports and use every dollar of tariff revenue to reduce taxes on U.S. producers. If the United States imports $2.5 trillion and manufactures food and fibers and imposes a 25% tariff, that would yield close to $600 billion to virtually eliminate corporate taxation in this country. What would such a tariff accomplish? First, a reduction of imports as their prices would rise, and a concomitant increase in orders to U.S. factories and farms. Second, as the profits of U.S. factories and farms surged, Americans would be hired to meet the new demand. The income and payroll taxes of those new workers would replace sinking tariff revenue from falling imports. Third, with corporate taxes cut to nothing, U.S. companies could cut prices on goods produced here, making U.S. goods more competitive both here and abroad. As foreign companies realized that the U.S. corporate tax rate was the lowest in the free world, they would relocate here. Fourth, as the price of imports rose 10, 20, or 30%, foreign companies would realize that to hold their share of the world's largest market, the $15 trillion U.S. market, they would have to shift production here to compete with U.S. companies. Companies like Mercedes, BMW, Toyota, and Honda would not only assemble cars here, but would build plants here to make their batteries, tires, motors, and frames. The tide of capital investment rolling into China would shift and begin surging back to the USA. That would be our message to the world, Every company and all products are welcome here, but if you want to sell here, you produce here, or you pay a stiff cover charge to get in. Would China, Europe, and Japan threaten retaliation? Perhaps. But we should tell Beijing, Brussels, and Tokyo we will accept a combined VAT tariff on U.S. products entering their markets equal to our tariff on their goods, but no more. Equality and reciprocity, not globalization and free trade, should dictate the terms of trade. And would China, Japan, or Europe risk a trade war with the United States when all three run huge annual trade surpluses with the United States? Every year, Beijing exports to us 6 or 7 times the dollar volume of goods we export to China. If the United States lost 100% of the world's markets we now have, but recaptured 100% of our own, we would be $500 billion in the black, for that is the size of our trade deficit with the world. We have nothing to lose but our trade deficits. We have a self-reliant republic to regain. Economists would cry protectionism. We can't turn our backs on the world. But no one is turning his back on the world. The goal is not to freeze out foreign goods, but force foreign goods to carry the same share of the U.S. tax load as goods made in the USA. A tariff so high as to lock out foreign goods produces no revenue. What is proposed here is not a protective tariff to keep out foreign goods, but a revenue tariff, with the rate set at a level to maximize revenue for the Treasury and maximize tax cuts for U.S. producers. What is urged here is that we do to the VAT nations what they do to us. Pleas, protests, and threats to take Beijing to the WTO have not persuaded the Chinese to let their currency rise. Let us accept that reality, cease whining, stop hectoring, and act. We need to bring manufacturing back and relearn truths taught centuries ago by Hamilton. Manufacturing is the muscle of a nation, vital to its defense and the securing of sovereignty. It is the magnet for research and development. It is organic. It grows. Around the factory form other businesses. Towns develop. Manufacturing workers average twice the wage of service workers. We need to change the way we think. Production must come before consumption. We cannot consume if we do not produce. We must start making things again. We must reduce our dependence on foreign nations for our national necessities and the loans to pay for them. If it can be made here, it should be made here. We need to start relying on one another and stop listening to the, quote, sophisters, economists, and calculators who gutted the greatest manufacturing nation the world had ever seen. Our problem lies not in ourselves, but in policies imposed by politicians in the hire of corporatists whose loyalty rises no higher than the bottom line on a balance sheet. A moratorium on immigration. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide, said the young Lincoln in 1838. He was right. While threats to the United States from abroad still exist, a series of 9/11 scale terrorist attacks or a nuclear attack, the threats from within are more immediate. There is the possibility of a run on the dollar, a default on the debt, and a depression. There is the danger of sustained decline in our living standards, the end of the American dream, and the social crisis that would come with it. And there is the possibility of a total disintegration of the nation into ethnic, class, and cultural enclaves distant from and distrustful of one another. If America is not to disintegrate, if she is to regain the out-of-many-one unity we knew in the Eisenhower-Kennedy era, the first imperative is to re-adopt the immigration policy that produced that era of good feeling, so that the melting pot, fractured though it is, can begin again to do its work. Elements of that policy would include a moratorium on new immigration until unemployment falls to 6%, to bring in foreign workers when 23 million Americans are still underemployed or out of work is to put corporate profits ahead of country. reform of our immigration laws to give preference to those from countries that have historically provided most of our immigrants who share our values, speak English, have college or advanced degrees, bring special skills, and can be easily assimilated. We need more taxpayers and fewer tax consumers. The border fence should be completed. The next president should declare that there will be no amnesty for those here illegally, that illegal aliens must return to the countries from which they came. The first to be deported should be those convicted of crimes, including drunk driving. The erroneous interpretation of the 14th Amendment, that any child born to an illegal alien is automatically a U.S. citizen, should be corrected by Congress via a provision attached to the law that it is not subject to review by any federal court or the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. government should undertake a series of high-profile raids on businesses that have hired large numbers of illegal aliens. Punishment of corporate scofflaws is the best prevention of this unpatriotic practice, and Congress should enact a constitutional amendment and send it to the states, making English the official language of the United States. The issues addressed by these proposals are becoming a matter of national survival, and if nothing is done to halt mass immigration, which now comes almost wholly from third world countries, the Republican Party as we know it is history. In 2010, James Gimple measured the correlation between immigration and voting patterns between 1980, when Reagan won 51%, and 2008, when McCain won 45%. The correlations are devastating. Between 1980 and 2008, Los Angeles County, the nation's largest, added 2.5 million people. The immigrant share of the population rose from 22 to 41%, and the Republican share of the vote fell from 50 to 29%. In Cook County, Chicago, the nation's second largest, the immigrant share of the population doubled to 25%, and the Republican share of the Cook County vote fell from 40 to 23%. So it went with virtually all of the top 25 of the nation's counties. Increases in the immigrant share of the population were matched by plunges in the GOP share of the vote. San Diego, Riverside, San Bernardino, Santa Clara, and Alameda counties in California, Kings and Queens in New York, Dade and Broward in Florida, Dallas and Harris in Texas all followed the pattern. In Manhattan, the immigrant share of the population rose from 24 to 34%, and the GOP share of the vote was cut in half to 13.5%. Either the Republican Party puts an end to mass immigration, or mass immigration will put an end to the Republican Party. As Barry Goldwater used to say, it's as simple as that. Barack Obama's decision in 2011 to scrap even a virtual fence on the U.S. border with Mexico suggests that the Democratic Party is not unaware of the fate that will befall the Republican Party if illegal immigration continues and the illegals are put on a path to citizenship. America is entering a time of troubles. The clashes of culture and creed are intensifying, and both parties are perceived to have failed the nation. Republicans were repudiated in 2006 and 2008, Democrats in 2010. And the crises that afflict us, culture wars, race divisions, record deficits, unpayable debt, waves of immigration, legal and illegal, of people never before assimilated, gridlock in the Capitol, and possible defeat in war, may prove too much for our democracy to cope with. They surely will, if we do not act now.
We hope you've enjoyed Suicide of a Superpower, a Macmillan audio production from St. Martin's Press. Text copyright 2011 by Patrick J. Buchanan. Production copyright 2011 by Macmillan Audio. All rights reserved.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program. Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.